Okay, Mr. Sanglang, good to go? All right, I am calling to order public meeting number 224 of the Mass Gaming Commission at our offices in Boston at 10 o'clock on September 14th. First order of business is the approval of the minutes. Commissioner McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that we approve the minutes of the August 10th, 2017 meeting as they appear in our packet, subject to corrections for typographical errors or for other non-material matters.
Second.
Who did the minutes this time? Haven't we lost our minute? Oh, yike. Well, I'm sure they're good. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Item number 3, Administrative Update, Director Bedrosian.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
Just on the 3A administrative update, a couple of items. Labor Day was the third but not final weekend of racing at Suffolk Downs on Saturday or Sunday. I went out on Saturday for about 3 hours. It was really a gorgeous day. Report our staff, as usual, has been doing a great job, and that's an older facility, and our staff continues to do a great job in terms of licensing and getting everyone ready for racing. It was a robust crowd the day I was there. I was not there Sunday. I think the weather moved in. It was a slightly lesser crowd. And then they will have one more weekend, which is the last day of the month and the first day of October. That split weekend will be the fourth weekend. So thank you to our staff, obviously. The second update is now that we are actually slightly less than 1 year out from opening of MGM Springfield.
What is the date? September what?
I think it's September 8th.
Oh.
That's the official date, so we are slightly a year
Amazing.
less.
Great.
And because we have started our pre-opening preparations, and while it seems like a year is a long time, it really isn't. So we have monthly meetings, staff does, with MGM Springfield personnel to go over all the regulatory and non-regulatory requirements that include building commitments, host community commitments, local commitments, and then obviously the core of that for us as we get closer to opening will be the commitments around gaming operations and what they need to do for their true gaming operations certificate. Those meetings, I think, will increase in tempo as we get closer to opening, probably be every other week, and then probably weekly, and then, a few days out daily. And just an FYI, next Thursday and Friday, our senior staff is going to be getting trained in project management software to help us track these commitments and use dashboards, and really something I hope that can be visual, and we can show the commission so that we're
So
operating.
so our directors are being.
Our directors,
and key
internal,
staff are being
yeah.
in for an internal tracking tool.
Exactly.
I'd like to see that. I didn't know you
Sure.
were working on that.
Absolutely.
I'm sure all of us would like to see it.
Absolutely. I think Commissioner Zuniga
I've
is
seen it.
well-versed in it, quite frankly.
I've used it, actually.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Great.
Jira.
I don't know if he's leading one of the sessions or not, but
Does the commissioner have an avatar?
Yes. There is an option to put an avatar.
I only smell trouble. So,
Well, so if maybe all the commissioners would be interested in seeing something, maybe you could
Sure.
put that on an agenda soon to show us what you're doing, us and the public for that matter.
absolutely. So that's an administrative update. With that, I would like to turn item 3B. This is, I think, something we are revisiting, our mission and values, over to Deputy General Counsel Grossman.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. We have
morning.
before you the core values and mission statement of the Commission for a look. You'll recall a couple of weeks back we discussed some of the modifications, and the version before you reflects the changes you requested at the last meeting.
Any discussion about these changes or any other ideas?
I thought it read nicely. I think you did incorporate those changes. It looks great.
I had one question, and that was in the core values, the second to last paragraph, we value a diverse workforce and supplier base and an inclusive culture internally and among our partners in the Massachusetts gaming industry. Who are our partners? Who's intended to be our partners?
I remember having a discussion about this in last meeting. I think initially there was a presumption that it would be people we license, but really it means everybody that we come in contact with, in my view. Other agencies that the Gaming Act touches,
Municipalities?
municipalities, surrounding communities, host communities, and the notion that everybody is treated as a partner, I think is a strong principle operating here.
Okay.
So it's pretty
Yeah,
much
I
everybody.
thought that was what the intention was, but I thought that the phrase "other participants in the Massachusetts gaming industry" and with industry not being capitalized would be more to the point.
I think partners sends the message that we're working with you.
But maybe that's too strong a message.
Yeah. I think the point gets made with your language. I agree. The question is, we're talking about angels on the head of a pin here, but I think we've always kind of tried to imply and say that this is a partnership. So, it's not a literal partnership, and this is a line we walk. We often say, we're your partners, but we're also your regulators, or in the case of the cities and towns, we're your peers. I don't know. I don't know that I needs to be, or either G and I need to be capitalized. That's really a super detail, but I think I'm comfortable with partners, but whatever. Anybody else have a reaction one way or the other on this?
I'm comfortable the way it is, but I get the point, but I'm comfortable the way it is.
Bruce?
I'm comfortable with that, yeah.
Okay, so, all right.
And as much as everybody is comfortable and the points have been made on the record, I'm comfortable.
All right, good. Learn to take your lumps in this business. Okay, any further discussion?
We need that.
We need a vote to adopt. Somebody want to move?
Mr. Chair, I move that we adopt the revised core values for the Massachusetts Gaming Commission.
In mission statement.
And to include the mission statement, yes.
Second.
I will note that I've met twice now with the new chair of the Cannabis Control Commission, Steve Hoffman, and the first time he came, he was sitting in the lobby and noticed our mission and values up on the wall and commented on them, read them, saw what they were, thought they were good, commented on them, said that was something he wanted to be sure he was doing right away too, so that was good.
Yeah, they hold up well, by the way. I think, when we first came up with them,
Yeah.
it was a very different time perhaps, but they hold up.
I agree with that. I mean, obviously, changing from emphasis of licensing to regulation, was natural. There's a few sort of things that we had to change to get up to date. But I'm proud of the values. I mean, I think we did identify things that we really care about, and we're, doing our best to stick with these. I agree. I think I think it's interesting that 6 years on, we have the same sense of what our priorities ought to be in terms of values. Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, in that vein, the next item, 3.
We just need
think
to
we-
vote.
Oh, I'm sorry, you
We
didn't
didn't
vote.
vote
Oh,
yet,
all
yeah.
right. I just,
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
okay.
Okay,
Sorry,
next up.
sorry, I'm jumping the gun there. In that vein, we are also revisiting an item that I think is a document that has served us well for the last 6 years, but might need a little revisiting, which is our enhanced ethics. And this is, I think, just like the mission and value statements went through a couple iterations with the commission. This is just the beginning of a conversation, which I will turn over to General Counsel and Deputy General Counsel. And what you have in front of you are just some suggestions of items for the commission to consider. Some are what I might call procedural, where do we file a particular type of disclosure or something like that, and some are more substantive. So with that, I will turn it over to General Counsel Blue.
Thank you, and good morning. I think Executive Director Bedrosian has pretty much summed it up. We'll let Deputy General Counsel Grossman go through some of the highlights, but this is essentially your first look at it. It is designed more to prompt the discussion. We will be having more discussion about some of the issues as time goes on, and then eventually redlining the code with what we finally agree to do. So, Deputy General Counsel Grossman, if you'd describe the high points?
Todd, before you do that, would you just, either of you remind us, the statutory mandate, it simply said, do an enhanced code of ethics? What was the mandate we were under the statute?
There is a mandate that says we shall have an enhanced code of ethics, which is more rigid than the state conflict of interest law. It does include, I think, 4 items that have to be in the code, such as not accepting gifts. I can't remember all the specifics.
Do you have it there, Catherine? Just out of curiosity, could you get it?
We can get it.
while we're talking?
We can get the
Okay,
language, yeah.
just for the record, I'd like to be reminded of what those 4
Sure.
were.
One of them must be the prohibition relative to employment after and before.
Well,
Or is that-
Section 23K Section 3 actually creates and governs the commission in many respects, and that's where the code is. And things like that are in, I think, other paragraphs, so they're not all required to necessarily be
In the code?
in the code of
Okay.
ethics, though we have incorporated them. There are a number of other provisions that govern our behavior here, though. So the code of ethics is intended to kind of encapsulate it all. Some of those things, though, we don't actually include in the code because they're in the statute. So we didn't want to create any conflict relative to the areas the commission could modify at times and those that it can't. And something like the post-employment restrictions are in the statute, so the commission can't modify that, grant variances or anything of that nature. So that's not actually even in the code of ethics.
Okay.
So just to add to the overview, the legal department and staff took the first pass at going through the code and identifying some areas that we thought the commission might be interested in having a look at revisiting, refreshing, or whatnot. It's certainly not necessarily comprehensive or all-encompassing, so if there are other areas, of course, we can add them to the list. But we thought we would present this to you just to get the conversation started and start thinking about whether we want to modify any of the existing provisions of the code. I'd be happy to go through them in any way that's helpful to you. There are a couple of areas that I think will attract the most attention. If you have that
We do.
provision.
We do. We have the section. The section is 23K, Section 3M, and it reads as follows. Chapters 268A and 268B shall apply to the commissioners and to employees of the commission, provided, however, that the commission shall establish a code of ethics for all members and employees that shall be more restrictive than said chapters 268A and 268B. A copy of the code shall be filed with the State Ethics Commission. The code shall include provisions reasonably necessary to carry out the purposes of this chapter and any other laws subject to the jurisdiction of the commission, including but not limited to, 1, prohibiting the receipt of gifts by commissioners and employees from any gaming licensee, applicant, close associate, affiliate, or other person or entity subject to the jurisdiction of the commission. 2, prohibiting the participation by commissioners and employees in a particular matter as defined in Section 1 of said Chapter 268A that affects the financial interest of a relative within the third degree of consanguinity or a person with whom such commissioner or employee has a significant relationship as defined in the code. And 3, providing for recusal of a commissioner in a licensing decision due to a potential conflict of interest.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, I think going through what you consider to be the highlights is a good idea, so go ahead.
Sure. I think the first one on here is worth a careful look. That pertains to how we treat consultants and how the code applies to consultants. That includes, at first, mostly it was our gaming consultants that we were concerned with. Now, of course, and over time, we have others. We have outside counsel. There's the Mass Council on Compulsive Gambling, all types of other entities that do consulting, what we would consider to be consulting work for us. And so we need to just have another look at how the enhanced code of ethics applies to these entities. And at the moment, it applies in many respects the same way it applies to employees of the commission. So that's an area that we thought you might want to have a second look at.
John, are we trying to make a, or as you just pointed out, our consultant mix has changed. Are we trying to differentiate between when a consultant is actually maybe visiting a gaming facility while they're working for us, or whether at some point, one of our consultants is taking a vacation? Are we trying to be that clear and make that type of distinction?
Well, I think we should, yes, I think we should try to make some distinctions. There is a provision in the existing code that we can try to make better use of, which says that it's not actually the entity that would be a consultant for purposes of the code, and it's not an entity that becomes a special state employee under the conflict of interest law. The law applies to individuals. So what we can do a little better is identify the individuals within certain entities who we contract with and identify those folks as the consultant / special state employee. That resolves some of those issues. So it's not everyone who works at a law firm that is prohibited from engaging in certain conduct, or everyone who works at the Mass Council who is prohibited from going to casinos. It's the folks who really do work for us that we're concerned with. So there are a couple of ways that we can modify and improve this part of the process. But one of them is making sure the underlying rule is sound. So that's why this is on the chart.
Now, what we've had our share of consultants that have now come and gone. Does the conflict on consultants goes away when their contract ends on the current or proposed?
I believe in large part, depending on what the contract says, that it would
Yeah.
essentially the relationship ends when the contract ends, and there's no post-employment restrictions or anything like that. So
Right.
they would no longer be consultants, which means the code no longer applies.
Applies. And what about, I'm sorry, what about non-paid advisors? We have a couple of advisory committees, a couple are statutory and others are ad hoc. Do they generally fall under this definition of consultant?
Well, it's an excellent point, and that's actually the last one on the first page, I think, gets to that point, where we recommend that we have a look at that. So those folks, by law, are considered special state employees, so there is a body of law as part of the conflict of interest law that covers their behavior, what they can and can't do. At present, in theory, they're also subject to the enhanced code of ethics. So the question is whether that's really, or that's what was the intended effect of the code, or whether that just sort of happened that way. But yeah, so that's something we should look at as well. All the members of the advisory committees and all of these folks who we train on ethics, we want to figure out whether we really think that all these provisions of the enhanced code applies to them.
Yeah, I would think, but I'll use someone who serves on the Public Safety Committee that may be from the county level. I think to prohibit that person from a casino might be something we do want to take a look at.
It's worth having a look, for
Yeah,
sure.
and as well as your point about individuals as opposed to an organization. The council's a good example. Certainly the Game Sense advisors should, of course, because they're working in the casino, but there are other folks, I'm sure, that have their job does not touch gaming at all, so casino gaming.
Right,
So
right.
I think that's certainly makes sense to look at that.
Yeah, we should try to remember what the filter is. What are we trying to accomplish here? And we first and foremost, we're trying to protect the integrity of the games and of the gaming regulatory environment. And secondly, we're being sensitive to the way things appear, to the optics. But when you actually start thinking about, should somebody who's serving on a local public safety committee, do you either risk the integrity of the process, or even create an optics problem if the person goes and gambles at the casino? Because, it seems like a big stretch, but we just want to remember what it is we're trying to accomplish here and use that filter to not overreach.
Well, on the one or the other, I think extending the code to unpaid advisors on some of these committees is a little bit more than necessary, in my opinion. I think the way I read the applicability to on the enhanced code of ethics is people, certainly us, and people who are considered a state employee by virtue of their contract with us. I think it really drops down when we get to these ad hoc committees, and that by itself may be a bit of a deterrent in our ability to attract the participation of some people that we want them to participate. They already volunteer their time in many ways, and we have to first train them and then enforce in some way or monitor the enhanced code of ethics. Somebody qualified and willing might say, you know what, I'm good.
Give you a break.
So that's just my, we drawing the line somewhere. It's, it may not be elegant, but I think that's my position.
One of the other areas of interest is the next to last one on the first page, where we talk about terms like licensee and the licensed under this chapter. These terms appear in Chapter 23K. We mirror them in the enhanced code in a number of areas. It's worth just affirming what those terms mean to the commission, whether that means really just the gaming licensees, or it means everyone who is licensed under Chapter 23K, including gaming employees, gaming vendors, and folks of that nature, not excluding people who are registered, because the term refers to people who are licensed. But the breadth of the term is important in a number of areas, including pre-employment restrictions, post-employment restrictions, some of the things that govern our conduct while we're here. And that's worth just having a close look to provide some guidance on where the commission stands on those definitions. One of the other areas that is of interest, this is on page 2. There are 2 entries on here that apply to immediate family. In Chapter 23K, Section 3, there is a restriction relative to immediate family members of commissioners and employees who hold major policy-making positions within the commission, and some of the financial interests and employment that can be held by their immediate family members. Now, the term immediate family is fairly well defined, and we in fact define it ourselves, consistent with the state conflict of interest law, as well as one area that the term is defined within Chapter 23K. So the definition itself is fairly well settled, and it's fairly narrow. So that's not really the issue. But the question becomes how, if at all, so we presently train our employees as to what the law is, but what type of diligence we expect of our employees when it comes to checking to make sure that the law is being complied with. And secondly, to that end, how close a relationship we would expect one to have with certain family members before we expect them to actually inquire of certain folks. For example, if they haven't spoken to someone who happens to be an immediate family member for a number of years, whether we expect them to call them up and ask them about their financial holdings. So these are a few areas that the commission should certainly have a look at and think about what exactly is expected of our staff when it comes to immediate family members.
What people think about that. And I think Commissioner McDonald went through this experience, but
We all
if,
did
if
anyway.
we have, well, we all went through the vetting, but, originally, but, if we have a kid or a parent or a brother or sister who owns stock in MGM, that is unacceptable under the present circumstances, right?
Yes.
It's not more than 5%.
No, no, no.
No, it's a financial interest,
A financial interest.
I believe.
Is that, do we mean that? Is that something?
Yes, that's a requirement, just like.
Well, I know that's
say.
what it means now, but I
But the
mean,
the question is, how often do we need to check? What is expected of us to certify, to ask, to demonstrate, you know?
But I'm raising the question, I know that's what it now says. I'm just saying now, in rethinking, is that something that we really think is central to the integrity of the process? That my brother, who lives in Lynn, can't own MGM stock? Is that?
Well, that is in the statute.
That's in
so
the
we
statute.
Oh, that's
can't-
in the statute.
We can't change that.
I'm sorry,
But we
okay.
can change how we apply it and what we
Okay.
think it means and what type of enforcement
Well,
there is.
And this also begins to get a lot more complicated when we talk about the definition of license under this chapter, which you alluded to earlier. It's easier to see the requirement of, asking relative to the three major gaming licenses, but it becomes very complicated because if we are talking about licenses of all the people that we license. Gaming companies, gaming vendors secondaries, people having to do nothing with gaming that are providing services to the casino. Those apply as well.
I guess I assumed, and maybe incorrectly, that we were talking about major gaming companies here when we inquire of relatives if they have stock. I never thought about a vendor. Do you know what I'm saying? So, like,
'Cause
is that right now every single person we license?
I believe it says a business which holds a license under the chapter, but I'd have to go. But there's a number of areas that terminology is used. I'd have to check on this area specifically. But that's why it's important for us to look at the term licensed under this chapter and
Right.
licensee and figure out what
Yeah.
we think it means. And it might have slightly different meanings depending upon the context.
Is the word gaming in there, or, I mean,
Well,
it's not the rug cleaning
not
company,
here.
right, that is a vendor?
The law does use the term gaming licensee in a few instances, indicating that the general court was certainly aware of the distinction between a gaming licensee and someone who is licensed under the chapter. So that's something to consider as well.
I see here that you're suggesting that in order to improve, just reading your text here, in order to improve the application and enforcement of the provision, consider clarifying the term, namely immediate family, to include only those members who live in the same household as are a minor child of, or are someone who has an active relationship with the employee in the MPP. Do we have that authority to alter the definition of immediate family for these purposes?
It's a fair question. I would argue that the commission has, authority when it comes to the enforcement of the laws under its charge, and we can at least clarify the type of scenario that you would consider to be a violation. So the answer, of course, is we can't modify the definition per se, but we can provide instruction via the code as to what type of diligence we expect of someone to be in compliance with
I
the
see.
code. And it might be a fine line, but I think it's one that is certainly within your discretion and one that is certainly worthwhile and for fundamental fairness purposes here. And you don't have to go too far to see a situation that would be inherently unfair to to give a strict reading to what that language says.
So this would be directed more to the obligations that would be incumbent upon us, kind of in the form of due diligence to determine whether or not the members that fall within the class of, quote, immediate, statutory class of, quote, immediate family, are in fact in compliance. So that you're, if I'm reading this here, you're saying that for these purposes, that we would have that heightened level of due diligence only as to minor child or as an active relationship with the employee of the MPP. And presumably other, spouses would be included in that.
Right. So, I mean, this is obviously some proposed language to get the conversation started, but hypothetically, if that was what was adopted and you had an emancipated child or someone, over 21 who lives across the country who you never see, we haven't spoken to in 10 years, and we later found out down the road that that individual somehow holds stock in one of our gaming licensees, that the commission is saying here in the code that we wouldn't consider that a violation to the point that we're going to enforce that and force you to resign your post here or anything of that nature. That's where we're going with it. And I think it's within your discretion to say that. And, period.
I think there's maybe a quadrant or a tiering that we could have, because there's two things at work. There's who's licensed under this chapter, and there's an obvious, the gaming license are the ones that everybody had in mind relative to the enhanced code of ethics, I'm sure. And there's tiers after that, gaming companies and secondary vendors. And there's also a close relationship relative to the family members. So perhaps there's, again, a quadrant that we can come up with relative to the level of due diligence and monitoring based on the relevant tiering, if you will.
I think so. I think it needs some work along those lines, exactly. And important to keep in mind, of course, what the public policy concern here was and where this came from. And that was that, a commissioner was going to get their kids some job at a casino once they award the license to the casino. And, we don't want that. Or you give some information to a family member as to investing in one of these licensees, or take some action because your family member holds a big interest in one of these licensees. So all of that was taken off the table. That was the concern here. And as we kind of move through this discussion, I think that's important to keep in mind, that those are the types of relationships that the legislature and the governor were concerned with when they included this provision in the law.
But I think you're right, and as others have said, it's very hard to imagine that they were thinking about vendors, It's got to be meant the gaming licensees. How do we, like in Section 8, which is the next one up, how do we interpret licensees now? We're required to give a list to prospective employees before they come to work and have them tell us whether they've worked for that applicant or licensee for the prior 3 years. How do we interpret that?
Yes, and and quite frankly, it's a small universe of folks, and we tend to know, when we're advertising for a particular position, really, the most times it's come up for us has been in technology.
Right.
So we know who our licensees are, and if someone applies from a company or something like that, we know they're prohibited. But it's been a challenge. I mean, quite frankly, I understand the reason behind it, but in a perfect world, there are probably some people from some of our vendors who would have been great to have because they understood the industry and everything like
Right.
that, but there is a prohibition. So.
But we in Section 8 right now, we interpret licensees to mean gaming licensees. We've made that.
No,
No.
No.
All licensees, all our vendors?
We do, we
Yeah.
interpret it as all, as best, we interpret it as anyone who's licensed under the
So
chapter.
we give new employee prospects a list of all our licensees?
We we try. I mean, we have, the problem is, and I think as Mr. Grossman has pointed out, there's a lot of people who are licensed by us. They're not necessarily our vendors, but vendors that work at the casinos, and the statutory language does seem to encompass all of them. So, you know, we try to, I think HR tries to ask questions through the hiring process to determine if anyone comes from those
But-
potential
And,
groups.
and that list is growing, which is, I
Yes.
think, why this
It's not
conversation is very
static.
relevant.
Yeah.
And it's not, it's becoming less obvious. You know, we're licensing, you know, architectural firms, construction, subcontractors, you know, by virtue of work, the amount of work that we do to the casino, which is why it's relevant for us to really think about how, you know, this tiering that I'm talking about, how it was intended.
Can you
There-
call up 23K3N?
I think
We
just
have
had
it, yes.
Okay,
Go ahead.
and does it, you said that the statute says all licensees. Read that. How do you
It
get
says,
that?
it says any business which holds a license under this chapter. So it's the
Is- You have a
same
gaming
broad
vendor
kind of
license,
language
right.
that we have, and it is something we should think about, because
Yeah.
it's becoming a much longer list, and it is
Right.
not always obvious, that's correct.
Go ahead.
Well, maybe now adding to the same point, but I also get the sense that, you know, maybe every industry moves in waves, but there's been quite a bit of consolidation in the gaming. There is some consolidation in the gaming industry, and that's something that we need to sort of consider as well when we're talking about all the vendors, gaming primaries and secondaries.
So I think we're all agreeing that we want to take a look at this. In the next one up, 8A, talks about, in addition to the statutory constraint, there's a 3-year look back on whether,
That was, I'm sorry, that's what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Right. When I was initially answering your question, the 3-year look back,
Right.
that prohibition was initially, I thought you were
Right.
asking, that was the question I was talking about.
Yeah.
And this raises, I think, what the commission struggled with, we struggle with, what I call the big L, little L dynamics, which
right.
is the big L being our gaming licensees and the little L being everyone else.
Right.
And if,
well, I think Todd's making clear that looking into what they and we mean by
Right.
licensees, whether it's big or little, is central here. It goes to a lot of these questions. I think all of us are getting a sense, a little uncomfortable with the applying these standards to people who, you know, to construction companies and contractors and towel providers. So let's make a major look at that issue. I also want to raise, whatever it is however we define the 3 years, however we define licensees, the 3-year look back seems a little onerous to me too. Why should somebody that, even if you worked for MGM, I mean, talking about the logistical issues of trying to hire good people, if somebody worked for MGM's IT department and.
well,
even-
but I could
even-
understand,
Excuse me.
yeah, I'm sorry.
Even, even a month ago, never mind a year or 3 years ago, is there a risk to to the integrity of the process to have one of our IT staff, come work for us? I think it's worth a look at
You know,
all of that.
I think one thing that may be stating the obvious is that, that there was certainly a risk, a higher risk, I would argue, prior to the award of those licenses.
The Big L license.
The Big L licenses. That maybe goes without saying. I think that risk is less, but there's real language that applies throughout when it comes to the Big L, and some of it we have to deal with, just live with. And in terms of applicability, again, the thin line here is how do we enforce, monitor, and expect of people to report that we can tier across some of these requirements to make life this whole process be able to be workable.
Some of this is statutory, and that's what we're kind of up against.
Yes.
The 3 years is statutory.
Yeah.
So we,
Well, this says, in addition to the disclosure required by 23K, Section 8A of the Enhanced Ethics Code goes on to say,
so what Mr. Bedrosian was discussing about the 3-year look back,
Right.
that term is in the statute. So
Okay. But
So
not
we could have
applied,
to
but
shoo
not
it.
applied under 8A. It's-
Yeah,
There's
right.
another 3-year
Yeah,
look back, but I was talking about this 3-year look
Yeah.
back. But I get it, but I think a hard look at, is what we're saying at all this makes sense, starting with how do we define licensees? Can we figure out what they
The-
meant?
the-
And then the underlying issues as well. Okay.
There's lots of other interesting stuff in here. I don't want to take over the whole meeting here, but, so I think at some point, we probably just need to reconvene and take a deeper dive on most of this.
Yeah, well, are there others that people want to raise?
Yeah, I had a question. I'm looking at number 13, and I think I understand that. What we're talking about there is in an emergency situation with our gaming agents, our state troopers, where they are required to stay on duty and work. That would be the exception we're talking about there. Is that correct?
Yes, and we do already have language that allows for people to stay as long as they pay with approval. But what this would do would be to just clarify that point, especially in the area of the pre-opening inspections, when we'll have a good amount of staff at these locations, and in the event of inclement weather and things like that, where we certainly don't want people leaving the premises to go stay somewhere else. Just that we explicitly say that in certain circumstances like that, with approval, that it is okay to do. So we're basically clarifying that point.
So we have a policy, but now we're including it in the enhanced ethics.
Well, we say already that you can stay in the course of your official duties with the prior approval of the commissioner or the executive director, but here we'd be fleshing out what some of the circumstances would be.
I just wanted back on section 8. If we, part of the problem with coming up with these regs is, if we end up putting them in there, we got to abide by them. And this does explicitly say, we will give each employee a list of all our licensees. And apparently at the moment, we're talking about all licensees. So we ought to be giving people a list. Either that or we ought to take this language out, one or the other. But if we're not doing it, we should be.
Yeah, and we, as you said, I think when we revisit this, we'll maybe look a little more in depth about the big L, little L
Right.
issue and how it
I'm-
plays across the statute and our regs.
I'm totally with it.
Yeah. Thank
At
you.
the moment, apparently. Okay, others that people wanted to raise?
Well, just on that,
Go ahead.
on that section 13, that, Mr. Grossman, you were saying, consider clarification allowing for stays by commission staff during the pre-opening inspections of the gaming establishments. I was kind of troubled by that, just sort of the scenario, if they're doing pre-opening inspections, staying for free in the,
No,
or not for free,
Not
but
staying for
staying,
free, yeah.
not for
Yeah.
free, but staying in the facility. I think there's an optic there. The last part of it, gaming agents in the event of hazardous weather conditions, that's an easy one.
It's a great policy discussion for the commission, I think, as to whether that's something we want our staff to be doing or not.
I would prefer only seeing an exemption if there's a weather emergency. There's a process by which the state declares a weather emergency, but, keeping in mind now where we know our 2 facilities are going to be licensed, there's certainly an opportunity, Springfield, for an example, there's a hotel 2 blocks away. It kind of gets back to optics of it, but certainly in a weather emergency, I wouldn't want to put any of our staff's life at risk by saying, sorry, you can't stay at the hotel, even though, Hurricane Irma is rolling through,
Right.
so.
So I think part of this, what I've heard from our staff is, the pre-opening time obviously is very hectic. We're going to have staff working long hours. And this is sort of the same analogy in the weather situation. While the hotel is up and open, we also don't know, believe it or not, I think you might hear the term, there's not a room to be had in Springfield. There's not a room to be had around Springfield. In the meantime, I think, as I understand, MGM will be doing is they'll be housing their folks in their own rooms, double bunking, stuff like that. If that were an option, it would also potentially cut down on costs for us versus just billing them back to send folks out maybe 10, 15 miles if we can't get a hotel room. But if obviously, if the commission is concerned about those pre-opening optics, that's not a situation we want to put our employees in.
I had a couple comments on 15, and we've talked about this before, but this is the one that says we can't, essentially, we and employees can't go to a casino and go shopping or have dinner. And I would be really interested. I understand, I totally get the optics on this concern. I'm not sure if I agree that it's a good idea. We've talked about this before. But I'd be really interested to know what other people do on this. Is it SOP, the other agencies, that they can't have dinner or go shopping? And if there's any analog, I was trying to think, are there any other analogous regulatory agencies where we could get some sense of best practice? So anyway, so as we pursue this, I'd like to have you look up a little bit and see what other folks do, particularly other gaming regulators and their employees. But also, are there other analogous, ABCC or SEC, or is there anybody else that's analogous to give us some guidance on this? And also, little 5 on this. The way this now stands is I can be exempt if there's like a family wedding or something. I have to write an application, I have to get approval from the executive director, and then it says I have to check in with the state police. That seems crazy to me. I mean, I have to apply, I get a written approval. I don't see why I should have to go check in with the state police when I go to a family wedding. So I'd look at number 5 on there, too.
I think that's the model I was familiar with. And what it does, there are no questions.
There's a record.
Again, it's optics. There's always a trooper on duty, obviously, and it's just, yep, here for the family wedding, and so there are no questions about the chairman being at a banquet or whatever. So it was a very simple process in New Jersey. Many retirement dinners were held at the casinos, frankly. I've spoken at many of them, and it's simple to do. It was not onerous at all to just let them know that you're there to speak at an engagement, whatever it may be. And so, just knowing how it works somewhere else, it just made it easy for everyone, and there were no questions about why you're here or if you have permission.
It's not a federal case. This is one of those many things which is just sort of a judgment call, and one person's sense of what fits is not the same as another's. But I just raise it as a question. When we get around to deciding whether we stick with this prohibition, which is the larger issue, then how do we implement it, whatever we do end up sticking with. I had one more. Anybody else have ones they wanted to raise?
I have one. It's the last one, and I think that the consideration here is appropriate. I would be inclined to act the way you sort of consider, to try to limit, to try to draw a clear distinction as to how it applies. Trying to go to sister or companies or entities that are not affiliated directly to the people we license or to the companies we license, would cast a blanket really wide, especially when we overlay all these other requirements in terms of monitoring. So I would stick with the same way that we qualify people. If there's a company that's wholly or mostly owned or partially owned by a parent company and so on and so forth, all of that still applies, because there's a question of control. But sister or other companies that have no effective operation or control, I would draw that line out, as it suggests here.
Got that?
Yep.
The last one I wanted to mention is 22, the prohibited communications. Particularly back in the days of the licensing, the big L licensing, we knew what we were talking about here. But as a practical matter, any issue pending before us, an application or of, as it turns out now, for any license, or any issue pending before us, or an adjudicatory, people constantly come up to us and, or at a dinner conversation, somebody says, yeah, what's going to happen to the tribe down in southeastern Mass, and, or whatever. So, and you can't, I don't think, you can't say to everybody who comes up, you're chatting with, or who sends you an email or something, I can't talk to you about southeastern Mass. So I just thought maybe some kind of, what this says is we may not engage in communications which may have an impact on us. And I thought maybe some language that softens that to sort of at least, outside incidental, or, what we really matter is having interested parties come talk to us about stuff. That's what matters. If it's just Mr. Smith down the street who's a neighbor, who's, who's just interested in it as a public policy question, that, geez, it doesn't seem right to me that the tribe doesn't blah, blah, blah. I can't see how that's a threat. So is there a way to clarify, focus on what we really mean, which is substantive ex parte communications from interested parties? That's a problem. But just incidental conversations, in the normal course of life, it doesn't seem to me is a problem.
Well, maybe this is what you mean by incidental, but I think that a conversation about what you intend to do or how you view something, a matter that's going to come perhaps in the future to the commission, and how you're leaning or voting, it's inappropriate regardless.
Is what?
Is inappropriate. It's not. It's,
Yeah,
it's
I-
what's meant. Whether that person is interested or not. Even if, in other words, even if that person is your neighbor. So I think informational conversations, of course. What happened in last week's meeting, sure, because it's all in the record. But if there's going to be a matter before us, if we know that this issue is eventually going to have to be decided, and expressing an opinion, in my view, even to your neighbor, is not appropriate.
Yeah, that's a different issue. I think that makes sense. That, we should not say, well, I intend to vote no, to our,
Or anything more subtle.
but, or words to that effect, right?
Mhm.
But whether we could hear them give us their incidental comments is what I was talking about. But anyway, I just raised it as one to look at, when we get around to it. Any other issues on the enhanced ethics code? Elaine and everybody else, and we have folks from Springfield here, we have folks from Plainville. Is to the extent we can get other people to comment on some of these things we've been talking about, if any of the licensees have thoughts about what works or doesn't work, what's important or not, let's reach out as best we can and try to get, these are interesting, not the end of the world, but interesting questions, and I'd be interested in outside observations from anybody that has them. So let's reach out as best we can. Okay. We are on to item number 4. Director Riffin. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm joined by my colleague Joe Delaney, the Construction Oversight Manager for the Gaming Commission. And we're here to present diversity exemption process for equipment purchases and contractors. So let me just talk about this a little bit and explain maybe for those who might be listening in. Diversity goals are based on the availability of diverse businesses. This policy, which focuses on design and construction period of our licensees, is in general alignment with current practice for the Commonwealth agencies and for public construction projects. There are certain categories that are excluded from the definition of total available spend due to the limited number of companies in the market or the availability or lack of availability of diverse firms. So I have included in your packet for your reference, Chapter 23K, Section 21A, which references this availability that I'm referring to. It states, "The gaming licensee identifies specific goals for the utilization of minority business enterprises, women business enterprises, and veteran business enterprises to participate as contractors in the construction of the gaming establishment," yada, 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 provided, however, that the specific goals for the utilization of such MBE, WBE, and VBEs shall be based on the availability of such MBE, WBE, VBEs engaged in the type of work to be contracted. So additionally, by way of background, the commission has approved each licensee's diversity plans, which each reference the potential to exempt certain spend categories which do not contain diverse contractors or companies. Introduction of this policy is in alignment with last year's state audit that generally suggested that the commission formalize informal procedures to ensure proper oversight. This policy creates a formal process that also aligns the process for all the licensees. It will create transparency and give the commission the ability to more easily monitor the diversity reports that are submitted monthly by our licensees to the Access and Opportunity Committee. With that background, I'm going to turn the mic over to Joe Delaney, who will review this diversity policy in more detail, compare it to the general practice of the Commonwealth and other agencies in this area, describe the policy itself and all the documentation that would be required of our licensees. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Just to jump in, just a little bit of background here on large-scale construction projects. Things invariably arise where there is not diversity available for that. Specifically, in these cases, we're talking about for large equipment purchases and also, in certain cases, for contracting within certain trades. And, as Jill mentioned, our licensees understood this, and they incorporated this notion of exemptions within their diversity plans. And really what we're doing is simply taking what's in their diversity plans, formalizing it into a policy that, again, will it'll make consistency for our licensees, but it also ensures that we're doing proper oversight of these, that we're reviewing applications and so on, and making sure that these are all legitimate requests.
Joe, let me just
Sure.
clarify. So you're saying that in the diversity plans, which we've already received and in many cases approved, there were exemptions made from the denominator, I guess, from the
Right.
from the available universe, based on their judgments at the time that a diverse purchase was not possible in that situation.
Right.
And so all you're now saying is that we take those already tacitly accepted exemptions and accept them by some policy A and B, put in place a review process to make sure that they're appropriate. Is that?
Yeah, I
getting
think
this
that,
right?
yeah, that's fair.
But they were not specific.
Right,
There
I
was
was
not a
just-
specific, there was not, nobody identified a contractor or a contract that they, at the time, because this was prior to many times even, knowing what they were going to be bidding. They had described a process. Each licensee had a slightly different process, and that's the point about being uniform here, for accounting for and having an exemption process. And I think it's very relevant now that we formalize it and signal to our licensees what we expect, and in many ways mirror what the state actually does in public contracts.
Right, and our licensees are on board with this. We've been talking with them for a few months now in working this up, and, you know, they're fully on board with what it is that we're proposing and comfortable with that. But, so when we started putting together these policies, we reviewed what other state agencies were doing with respect to diversity exemptions. We looked at Massport, we looked at the Supplier Diversity Office, Mass DEP, and Mass DOT, bunch of agencies. And each agency has some mechanism for waiving these requirements. Because as I said earlier, every large-scale construction project runs into something that doesn't, you know, fully fit in the right box there. And in our memo to you, we referenced the Supplier Diversity Office and how they will do exemptions for cities and towns that are doing public construction, specifically for things like the School Building Authority and things of that nature, where they're using state money to build a local entity. So there's a whole process there. But each of them had a process, and they all use different names. Some of them call them waivers, modifications, exemptions, but in the end, they all accomplish the same thing. And what we put together here is really, it's completely consistent with what all of those entities are doing. So now what we've presented to you, we've developed two policies. One is for equipment purchases, and another is for contracting, for hiring contractors. And they have slightly different submission requirements. You know, for the large equipment purchases, it's pretty straightforward. You know, in fact, a number of these things are really almost self-evident. There are only a few manufacturers of elevators. There are only a few manufacturers of cooling towers and things of that nature. And they're large multinational corporations, you know, so some of these things, not a whole lot of documentation really needs to be submitted. We need to know who the manufacturers are. We need to be able to verify that there are no, you know, no manufacturers that are diverse firms. And we need to know what efforts that our licensees went through to try to secure diverse firms. And, you know, and if in fact they found a firm that they didn't use, why they didn't use that firm. So I think on the equipment purchase side, it's relatively straightforward. When you get to the exemption policy for contractors, it's not really as cut and dried, because in instances where if you're hiring, let's just say, an electrician, and you're saying, well, there are no diverse electricians around here, well, maybe there's a subcontractor that can give you some supplies or this or that. So there's usually more opportunities to find some diversity rather than saying, I'm buying this giant piece of equipment and there's no diverse firms. You're saying, I'm hiring a contractor, and there's probably some opportunities for subcontracting or other things of that nature. So what this process really is we need a very detailed documentation of who did you call, who did you try to, you know, engage, did you advertise, did you, you know, what are all of the good faith efforts that you went through, excuse me, to try to secure a diverse firm. And then and only then will we really consider, you know, waiving that requirement. We haven't gotten a request for a contractor at this point, but we felt that it was important to set up a process that was similar, because it could happen. One of the examples that we've thrown around is the moving of the church out in Springfield. And
Very few who can do that.
yeah, there's very few contractors who do that, and that would probably be eligible for a waiver if, you know, they did the necessary research. They haven't asked for one, but, you know, that's just an example where we felt that's probably a case could be made on something like that. But we're not saying that a drywall contractor, just because, you know, you couldn't get the right price or whatever, that's like sort of a legitimate waiver. So anyway, once we get all the information from our licensees, we'll review them internally, and we'll either approve or deny the request. Or we may ask for, you know, if we're not comfortable with the information, we may ask for more information, you know, to just further justify it. We had asked each licensee to send us a couple of samples of the documentation that they have and would send to us, and we included those in your packet, and I apologize. They are more voluminous than I even thought at the time. I don't expect that you need to read those, but you can see that it's really a rigorous process that they go through, and that there's a lot of documentation. It's very detailed, and you know, we feel that with these policies that we're comfortable that we'll get the right information and that we can, safely say that, yes, we believe that these things don't, shouldn't be included in that denominator in the diversity categories. And with that, I'd be happy to open up for any questions.
Joe, and Jill, I have a couple of questions. From all appearances, it looks like the bar is set higher somewhat in review of a exemption request for a contractor as opposed to
Yeah, absolutely.
an operator. Do you feel any need to kind of incorporate this process into our regs?
We were feeling that a policy was probably was satisfactory on that. We've got good, this is something that's going to essentially terminate within a couple of years.
Okay.
Once the construction is done. I mean, when they're doing further construction, we may have to, sort of resurrect it a little bit, but
Well, it'll come up in the operations phase, too.
I think we're going to have to develop some stuff for operations, based on some lessons learned that we have with Plain Ridge and others, that for exemptions, I think that there will probably be certain circumstances that arise, and maybe at that point, if it's something that we're going to incorporate into the long-term operations, maybe then we might want to do that as part of the regs.
Okay. Under contractors, for the 5 kind of levels of detail that you're looking for, just to clarify, somebody has to demonstrate and provide all 5?
Yeah.
Okay. And other agencies have done this primarily on the contracting side? Have they mentioned whether they had any feedback or comments or viewpoints from, the building trades on the contractor piece?
Well, the exemption policy for contractors largely came from the DEP policy, which I wrote when I was at DEP.
That's what you're-
Or I
you're
should
familiar
say
with
I wrote it. I worked on it. So we had pretty good success with that. We had very few actual requests for exemptions because we did have this policy that said this is what you need to do, and it's a high bar, and most people would try to sharpen their pencil a little bit more and find somebody, so that they wouldn't have to go through this.
The only other comment I would make, and I guess I did kind of geek out and go through some of the attachment information that came in, but, your and Jill's memo talks about SDO grants waivers for MBEs and WBEs. We've added a new element to that with VBEs, and looking at, precast material for a garage, lots of different firms came up. It looked like 17, or maybe I'm miscounting. I guess, is the question also being asked, because VBE certification is so new, that one of those firms could have said, yeah, I understand Otis Elevator may not be a VBE firm, but could one of these, are we approaching the question of VBE status, or the new opportunity for a company to register as a VBE? Just kind of thinking that through as, a waiver comes in front of you. It's like, okay, yes, not an MBE, not a WBE. Let's push the
Right.
question on the VBE more than maybe it's alluded to here.
Right, and I believe SDO is now certifying VBE contractors. So
Right.
that
Yeah.
issue where we had to do certifications, or there were these sort of other
Right.
certifications, SDO being the primary repository for that makes it certainly easier.
I guess I'm just, cautioning before
yeah.
we jump too far to the exemption, raise the new question, and, we've seen evidence of, oh, yeah, it happens that, the president of the company is a veteran. Okay, let's walk you through that piece of
Right.
the process.
Good
I-
point, Commissioner.
I think there's, I think it's very straightforward, and I'm in agreement with having it, and implementing it the way it's written. I have just one question. I know there's going to have to be some sort of catching up a little bit, because some of these projects are already under construction, of course, or not some, but they are. Should we talk about a time frame in these policies in terms of submission and response? It would be too unfortunate if we end up, having to do a lot of these after the fact. simply because time frame was not understood. And I guess part of my point is, can we embed some kind of proactive a priori rather than always looking back? This is who we have already in the job, let's say, and all we're talking about is, whether you're going to allow me to count something for a number or not, rather than making sure that people are trying as much as they can before they actually contract with somebody. And I know a lot of it has been bought out in one case, but is there anything in terms of time frame that we could embed here?
Yeah, I think, well, on both of the projects, they're largely bought out at this point, so this
Yeah.
is being a little bit reactive to that, and there will be a large slug of information that will be coming in on all of these things too, that we'll have to sort through. And I think right now, my thought was that we would meet with our licensees and just establish some timeframes with them to say, all right, get us, 25% of them on this date, and, and just come up with a schedule to get things submitted to us. Because they have to pull together the information. I mean, they have most of it, but they have to put it together in a format that's workable, and then we have to be able to work our way through it, and, so it's going to be kind of a bit of a process right now.
Fair
But
enough.
we could certainly add in timeframes for review and approval and, 30 days or whatever the number might be. But going forward, if there are other items, we want them to come to us before they, sort of self-exempt them from the categories.
Absolutely. Sound good?
Well, just to say that I think what you're proposing here is very sensible, and I'm gratified that you're reporting that the experience to date is that the licensees and the contractors, in fact, have been complying satisfactorily with the effort to explore diligently the existing availability of these protected categories. And I do think it makes sense to have drawn on the work that they have done and the documentation that they have done, and to establish a single standard, if you will. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would agree. Anytime you can clarify the process, it's helpful to everyone.
I think I know you guys well enough, and now I've heard the way you're going to implement this, that I know that it's not going to become an excuse for getting out of doing the real work. But I want to just make 2 points anyway. One is that there is a sort of a slippery slope argument. There was a time when there were hardly any MBEs, and if all you said was, well, if there aren't any, you don't have to worry about it, we'd still be back with hardly any. So we got to be real careful, A. B, just because there aren't any MBEs available or whatever the category is within a certain area, doesn't mean that you shouldn't still have to hit your overall percentage. It just means you got to work harder where there are available MBEs. So we're taking the pressure off our licensee. Each time we exempt a category, we make it a little easier to make the 10% because all of a sudden the denominator got smaller. And by not letting them get exemptions, it means they just have to work harder and exceed by a lot the 10% where there are available categories, which is all to the good within reason. So I think you guys get that spirit, and I don't doubt that you do, but I just wanted to make those points anyway.
Yeah, I would echo that. It'd be interesting. I think I agree that, the policy is pretty sound. It certainly read a lot better for me on the equipment purchase side, but I'd be curious, the first time you get an exemption, come back in front of us and kind of tell us how you walk through it, and, give us an example of how you, kind of made the decision. We're not just sending you off to enact the policy. It'd be great to get some feedback as to how it worked.
Yeah, it's a good point. I agree with that. Anybody else? Do we need a action on this? No.
We've asked for a vote.
Well, it's not on for vote, and I think we can decide, we can come back, we actually need a vote. I think it's within my authority as executive director on a policy, not on a regulation, but on a policy to implement it. And I think I also get a sense of the commission on this. So we'll formalize it. If we think we need to come back, we'll come back.
Yeah, we can always do it.
Okay.
Exactly. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Before we go to 4B, let's take a real quick break. Okay, we are reconvening public meeting number 224, and item 4D on the agenda is Commissioner Stebbins. 4B on the agenda.
You got off the hook? Good morning.
Was that wrong?
I just wanted to update everybody on the process. We are in the middle of to create a white paper with strategies to use monies that will eventually flow into the Gaming Economic Development Fund. I think all of you received a copy of the public invitation letter that went out about a month ago to regional economic development leaders, planning authorities, workforce boards, tourism bureaus, our community colleges. The invite included copy of the statute language for the Gaming Economic Development Fund as well as a list of all the stakeholders receiving the invite letter so we could encourage some collaboration. In addition, every state lawmaker representing a host or surrounding community, every mayor or board of selectmen, every planning or economic development director, if one was part of that town's government structure for each host and surrounding community was also copied on the letter. We followed that up with some regional phone calls with the invited stakeholders to field some questions. I was encouraged. I had a great call from the planning director from Foxborough who reached out to me and was interested in corralling her colleagues to work together. I know she even had a chance to go over and visit with the team at Plain Ridge to discuss how they might be able to work together.
Great.
These draft strategies are due tomorrow, and I've already spoken with Elaine Driscoll. We will find a way to put those up for public comment. We did receive our first strategy letter yesterday from the team at Bristol Community College. Our plan is to use our upcoming meetings in Springfield in 2 weeks and Everett in October, and hopefully a meeting in Plainville to hear more about these strategies from the proponents and give all of us as commissioners a chance to ask questions. So that's really just an update as to where we are in the process, and certainly appreciate everybody's interest and participation.
This is going great, Commissioner. I give you real credit on this. This was a flyer of an idea, and, we said, by all means, try it, but it wasn't at all clear to me that it was going to get any teeth or any traction, and it has. You've really generated a lot of interest, which is great. So are you routinely in touch with either the committee chairs, Wagner or Lesser, or their staffs on all these, on what's going on and on the meetings and conversations?
That's a great point. I have not caught up with them recently, but I think tomorrow being a deadline for the strategies to come in, it'd be a great time to circle back with both of them and just kind of give them a heads up.
I would think giving the member a heads up, just a discussion, just talking to the two chairs, but maybe getting either Rory O'Hanlon, if he's the right guy in Wagner's staff, and Samantha in Lesser's staff, if that's the right person, maybe to come to one or more of these meetings.
Sure.
Because if the key staffers are really familiar with it, that will help a lot, the possibility something might come of it when the legislature actually gets around to the appropriations process.
Right.
And I'll bet you that people like Sam and Rory or others would be willing to come to the public meetings you just got through talking about.
Okay. And, I think it'd be our goal to also let lawmakers know, anybody else that, say in Springfield, we're going to set aside some time. A lot of it will depend on, the number of strategies we get in. But certainly invite them to come and listen to the presentations and the ideas as
absolutely.
well. Use it.
And maybe Ways and Means staffs also.
Absolutely.
The key people from the two Ways and Means staffs.
Absolutely.
Jeff Sanchez.
Jeff Sanchez
No,
is, we've got 2 or 3 people from his office, and who's the woman who's Senate Ways and Means?
Senator Spilka.
Spilka, yeah.
Right.
We've got some, so we'll get, if you don't have them, we can get the contacts there
Sure.
too. That's great.
I want to say that too. I think it's picked up quite a bit of interest. It reminds me now on an earlier item of the agenda, our mission, having a participatory process is really important, and in this way, it sounds like very organically, your slow, methodical approach, sending letters and having some of these conversations early on is really paying off in some way and being very good in many respects. So
Yeah.
thank you for all this.
And we've set out, were you about to say something? Excuse me. Go ahead.
I was waiting in line, but, and it's just a very brief comment, but I just want to make a note on the record of prior conversations that I've had with Commissioner Stebbins, in which I have expressed my, admiration for his initiative here and what's already been accomplished in terms of the constructive response by interested parties and jurisdictions. I think it's great.
Yeah. As I have thought about it, as we've all written about it, as we've talked about it, and certainly as I talk about it publicly, a critical underlying concept in our legislation and in the way we've tried to implement it is that can you take casinos, in our case, particularly the integrated resort casinos, and go beyond jobs and revenue? We know you can generate jobs, we know you can generate revenue. Can you generate broad-based economic development? Can they actually be a broad-based economic development generator? And it begins to look like it can, but having you take this to the next level really contributes to that. So I just think it's an exciting project, and we're pretty much doing something here, and the licensees are living with it, to figure out whether you can take a post-industrial city, as Springfield or an Everett, and environs, and actually change the economics of that post-industrial city and environs. And if we can do that, it's not being done anywhere. You can maybe in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but that's about it. So this is really an exciting project.
I want to pass along kudos. I haven't been doing this work in a vacuum. Jill Griffin and John Ciamba and Elaine Driscoll and Janice Riley, I think that's everybody, have been critical to, again, helping pull, and Derek Lennon, helping to pull the information together to make this a pretty thorough examination, and to Professor Paul DeBole out at LaSalle College, who offered his time to weigh in on the process. And
Did he follow through and give you some?
He has been. He's been happy to take on a couple of projects, because I might help him avoid painting the garage this summer. So he's been doing some research for it. And our old friend Lyle Hall from HLT, well, not with HLT anymore, but also reached out.
Great.
Had followed some of the progress we were making. So
Great. That's really exciting. Thank you. Okay, next up is item number 5. That would be Dr. Lightbound and the Racing Division.
Good morning.
Okay, good morning, Commissioners. With me today, we've got Bruce Barnett representing Suffolk Downs,
Good morning.
and Doug O'Donnell, our senior financial analyst. The first item is the request by Suffolk Downs for an additional $288,000 up to that amount for purses for their last weekend of racing. You all approved the final weekend a couple of meetings ago, along with the purse money for it. And with their second weekend, they ran extra races. They ended up having abundance of horses in the area, so they were able to race 15 races each day. So that ate up a lot of their purse money. So in order to maintain the same level of funding for the final weekend, they've asked for the ability to use up to an additional $288,000 from the Racehorse Development Fund. The number of races that a meet runs each day isn't an exact science. The racing secretary has an idea what horses are available, but it can vary. For instance, at Plain Ridge, sometimes during the year, there's a lot of racing in other states, and they're competing for horses. They may run 7 races. Other times, they may have plenty of horses and they'll run 12. So it's not unprecedented that, the amount of races in a certain day vary. Obviously, with Suffolk racing a fewer amount of days overall, they have fewer days to level it all out. In the past years, the first year, they had about 78,000 left over that they did not use. And last year, there was, about 191,000 that was left over. So if you add them up, it's just a little bit under what they're asking for anyway, if you wanted to average it out over the 3 years. That's all on see-through on the comptroller's website. It shows exactly what payments have been made to Suffolk. And I want to commend our financial team for putting all that information out there. It's very easy to see if anybody has any questions about the money that we've given out. They can go right on that website and it's all there. If you have any questions.
That's, what is the link? That's
it's-
our website?
No, it's on the comptroller's website.
Oh, on the comptroller's
Yeah,
website.
and it's called See-Through, the letter C, THRU. And you can click on that, click on MGC, put MGC in there, and then you can put racehorse development in, and then you can put whatever track you want, Suffolk Downs, Plain Ridge,
Right.
or any of the other areas that the Racehorse Development Fund goes to.
That might be a link, Elaine, we could put on our racing site to that, just to make it that much simpler. Great.
And on our website, we do have the amount of money that's in the Racehorse Development Fund. That's right on our website. And there's about 12 million in the fund, so obviously there's not a question of the money being available.
And if I understand it correctly, Dr. Lightbaum, the request is made for an amount, and it's really their best estimate as to what they'll need, but that is not given to them and then given back to us. It is a question of once it's over, then the payments are made according to what they spent.
Correct. Before each weekend of racing, I talk to Chip Tuttle, and we get an estimate about what they will need, and we send them that. And then at the end of the year, we always keep maybe 1 day's worth of the money back. They do their true-up, and once they've given that information to Doug and I, and we've gone over it with Suffolk, we'll issue the final payment that'll make them whole for the year. So.
Yeah, I asked questions about this request, thinking, this isn't a lot of money, not to have been planned for, but I did learn that, requests go out for horses at various locations, and it just happened that that particular weekend, there were a couple of other meets that were not running, so they had more horses than they thought. So it was not a question where they didn't plan well. It really was a question of circumstance, and they had more horses, and providing the opportunity for those horses to run. I know
Correct.
that you're in discussion about how to make sure your staff is prepared to deal with that in the future. So
Right.
I'm comfortable that this is not an oversight, this is not any kind of, it really is a legitimate request based on the circumstances, which were, as you say, not an exact science.
Correct.
I guess I just had a question. I mean, obviously, what happened the last weekend there was racing, I think as Commissioner Cameron just pointed out, was somewhat of a surprise. Is there any expectation you'll face that same predicament in the last weekend?
Commissioner, I don't know the expectation there. I can tell you this, though. For the third weekend, Labor Day weekend, my understanding is that once again there was the interest and the potential to book more races than were run. That weekend, knowing that we were already sort of ahead of pace, they did not card, as I say, all of the possible races. And in deciding which races to card and which horses to fill them with, they gave a preference to the trainers who had supported the program in 2013, 2014, the last year of full racing. So I think with this, those decisions can be made for this overall health of the program. They'd rather not have to be there. But knowing what the full budget is and that we're at the last end of the racing season, I think they will more aggressively manage the numbers.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Commissioner Stebbins, I had talked to Mr. Tuttle about this issue also in two regards. One was, gee, should we have known ahead of time? And then Alex explained to me sort of the perfect storm of events. And second is, I think something that Commissioner Cameron referred to is additional, 8 races a day for Alex's staff, who serve a temporary staff, 2 days in a row. Yeah, it's a Herculean task they just stepped up to.
Right.
So I've talked to him that if they submit a racing application for next year, we may want to build in some safeguards, both on purse money and also on, Alex's staff, so that, if there's, maybe the commission would oversubscribe purse money with the caveat contingency that 72 hours before, a reasonable time before the actual race, they come back to Alex or I, with what the numbers will be, so we could approve both. She knows what the regulatory side will be, and we'll actually know in front of purse money what it will be. So I think we will have those discussions.
I mean, it certainly helps with planning, and obviously, we're only talking about one more weekend left for this year. I'm just interested to see if there was, could we anticipate or expect another surprise of other races being canceled and more horses?
Well, in those discussions I had with Mr. Tuttle, I think he committed to being, managing this last weekend in a way that was consistent with what now they will have been given for purse money.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's important to do. I want to register my discomfort in the principle operating here, which is, it says there's an economics term, there's an adverse selection that Suffolk Downs went through because they knew that, they could always card more races and then come back and ask for money that's been sitting there from the Racehorse Development Fund. I know it's an unusual year, let me start with that, and this has been an unusual year in the past. But if we can strengthen our communication, our expectation as to what's a maximum number of races, I know in the end, it's all being funded at the average that we have funded in the past, but I can only imagine that the decision could have been very different at the time in terms of what races by Suffolk Downs, not by you, Dr. Lightbaum. If they knew that the ability of that money, that the availability of that money was not there. So I am ultimately going to be voting in favor of this because ultimately it does benefit the horsemen, and it's all in the rubric of trying to do the best we can with the racing industry. But the principle at operation here of we can always come back and ask for more money to the commission is just something that doesn't sit very well with me.
Do you remember, Doug, there's a 75-25 split in the Racehorse Development Fund now, right? How much is?
No.
65-45.
Oh, 65-45.
No, 45,
45,
55.
55, after last year, 45, 55.
X and Y, there's a split.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, right. Do you remember what's left in each bucket? So we're taking, this is coming out of the thoroughbred share, right?
Oh, yes. It could only.
In that 12 million, how much is?
The Plain Ridge money goes out every week.
Right.
So that, we don't hold on to that.
So there's
That goes
no-
out, as well as the payments for the breeders, of both breeds and the horsemen's amount.
So the
So
12
that goes
million,
out every week. The money for Suffolk, where they're running the, abbreviated meet, we just send out what's asked for, each weekend.
so the 12 million that
So-
you're referring to is essentially all thoroughbred money? Because the standard bred
Almost all of it
just
is.
is all used on a pretty much a real-time basis.
Yes.
Is that right? You're looking
Yeah.
puzzled?
No,
No,
that's,
okay.
that's accurate. But then, as Alex said earlier, once the meet is done, we will sit down with
Yeah,
Suffolk
right.
Downs and make the adjustments as to what their total numbers are at the end of the meet, so.
Right, okay. Great. Anything else on this topic?
Well, just to say that when Alex described it to me, when we spoke about this yesterday, it was encouraging to be assured that there's no final approval on this until there is what you described as the true-up process.
Right.
Having gone through, so that it's not as if the funds are just transferred and there is no accounting for it.
Right, we
There's
don't
an-
give the funds out and then have to ask for some back at the end of the season. After the last day, we get the final amount and send it out.
Mr. Chair, I move the commission approve the request of Suffolk Downs for an additional $288,000 from the Racehorse Development Fund for persons.
Second.
Commissioner Cameron, second. Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
So next up, Doug O'Donnell will go through the Suffolk Downs capital improvement request for payment and request for consideration on different items.
Alex, before you do that.
Oh, go ahead.
Can I just say,
Did you- sorry.
first of all, thank you. Second of all, I should have said this earlier. Chip is out of the country today, which is the reason he's not here. His children go to college out of the country.
That's no
And
excuse.
he's dropping them off this week.
Thank you.
Scotland.
Correct.
Okay, first up would be the request for consideration for Suffolk Downs Capital Improvement Trust Fund. There are three projects on this particular request. Computer upgrade cost, sprinkler system repair, and an EPA sewer inspection repair. The total amount for this request is $88,951.28. It has been approved by the architect, and all the necessary paperwork is in order for this. And we do need your approval on it.
Well, we can do them all at one time, right? You want
Yeah.
to do, I think that's probably more efficient.
Okay. And following up with this is the request for reimbursement with the Suffolk Downs Capital Improvement Trust Fund. There are 4 specific projects on this, which all the work has been done. Again, the paperwork has been submitted, checks have been cashed, and the total amount for this reimbursement is $116,658.43. Balance in the fund right now is $824,303.01. And once we reimburse these funds, they will have a total of $707,644.58.
Hey, Doug, quick question.
Yes.
Sorry I didn't catch this. I'm looking at the items under reimbursement. They don't seem to add up to the total request. The 4 items?
2, 4, 6.
You know,
No, you're absolutely right, they don't.
should be a zero there.
Yeah. Mm.
1, 2, 3, 4. Probably, yeah. Bear with me for 1 second.
Do some quick math.
Good get, Commissioner.
That is right. It's more
Just
like
think, Bruce, we
60,000.
spoke earlier and you said everything just lined up perfectly.
You know,
right?
now you're putting me on the spot, I'll put you back.
More about 60,000, you're right.
Yeah.
Oh, but you know what? The
Is that the
88.
total? Yeah. That's the
Oh, no,
total,
the 88 is fine.
which isn't clear here. That's the next one combined, right?
Yeah. They're all in here.
So what's missing here is the individual total, which when you add it to the 80, which you do have on the next memo, and when you add that to the 88, I believe it'll be correct.
Yes. This is the total. 116 is the total for both.
116 is the total, yeah.
Yeah.
For both.
For both. So it's just missing that
You
in
You're
between
missing the
number.
subtotal in the request for reimbursement.
Mhm. That's, yeah.
Yeah.
So the request for reimbursement is 41, give or take, plus the 88.
Right.
Oh,
Still too much.
Still
That's
too
all right.
much, sorry. Scratch all that.
I'm sure we could authorize the numbers to be verified, make sure they're correct before we
Yeah,
authorize this payment to go out. So
maybe
we
subject,
could approve it with the,
subject to the approval of
We
the,
can-
let's say, of the ED.
Yeah, we can approve.
Yes.
We can approve the 4 individual projects.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the
it's
3
gonna-
more. There's
it's gonna be
there's
the
3
whole-
from one,
the
4
whole-
from another, yes.
The whole bunch of them here, it looks like. The numbers are,
Well, there's a few for Plainridge, so
oh,
Yeah, so there's 2
we
for
should keep
Well, they got-
Suffolk.
okay.
There's 2 for Suffolk and 2 for Plainridge.
You can, did we start a motion here?
On the first one, it's just for consideration of the
Right.
project, and then the second one's for actual
The
payment
disbursement.
Right.
of the money for the project.
Right.
So, Mr. Chairman, I move the commission approve the request for consideration for the Suffolk Downs Capital Improvement Trust Fund for $88,951.28.
second.
And, oh,
No, let's do that.
Let's just do that one
Yep,
first.
second.
all right, further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
And then, Mr. Chairman, I'd move the commission approve the 4 items for reimbursement for the Suffolk Downs Capital Improvement Trust Fund as outlined in the memo included in the packet.
Second,
Second.
further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
And that total amount will be, of these 4 items, is $41,858.30.
Okay.
What was that again, Doug?
For the Suffolk Downs Capital Improvement Request for Reimbursement, it's $41,858.30.
Okay.
I know we've sort of talked about this in the past, but why, these are from 2012? Why are
Right.
5 years old? Why does it take 5 years to?
They had done the work, but they're just getting caught up now because they had that EPA project a number of years ago that they
Yeah, I
had
know.
paid,
Drained it.
yeah, $3 million plus.
Right.
So that had been taken, they paid that, so over the years, we've been paying that off with the Capital Improvement Trust Fund. So now they're just getting caught up for all the additional work.
You mean there wasn't enough in the Capital Improvement Trust Fund?
Correct.
On a real-time basis to get it, so they've had to do it over multiple
Correct,
years?
because they pay that in advance, and then
Right.
as that built up, they were reimbursed for that project, so.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully, when we get our racing reform legislation, we can rethink this whole thing, which
Right.
is bizarre. Okay, are we ready to move on to Plainville?
Yes.
All right.
First is the request for consideration, Plainridge Racecourse Capital Improvement Trust Fund. They have 3 specific projects on this request: water truck purchase, purchase and installation of new photo finishing system, and purchase and installation of the infield fencing for a total of $90,120.59.
There's 2 memos here, Doug. One,
One is for the request for consideration, the other one is the request for reimbursement.
Just flip.
all right, there's only, all right. So the 29,000, the water truck purchase appears on both memos.
That is for, right, that's for Suffolk Downs, because the request for.
No, I'm looking at,
Plainridge.
I'm sorry, yeah, Plainridge. Yeah, they went out there, the architect went out and approved the purchase of the water truck, and coinciding with that, they had purchased it. That was the first time he saw it for the requisition for, request for consideration. And then it was also on the request for reimbursement, because he went out there, they requested that information, the truck was purchased, and that's why they're both on this, on the agenda today.
Because what happens is we're approving the project and then we're approving the disbursement.
Right.
That's the
Because
difference.
they had,
between-
yeah,
We're just doing it at the same time here for the same project.
okay. So you're, all right.
Do we need a motion? Are we,
Yep. I'd be happy to move that that the commission approve the request for consideration from Plain Ridge Racecourse in the
I see.
amount of $90,120.59 for the projects outlined here in the packet.
Second?
Second. Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously to consider. Now,
Yes,
What do
and
we
now
do?
I would,
Now it's
And we did
request for reimbursement, which is the payments for the Plain Ridge Racecourse Capital Improvement Trust Fund. There were two items on this, which was the water truck purchase, and Mr. O'Toole just informed me that that was an auction that they were bidding on, and that's why it happened so quickly for them to pay it out and to be approved by the architect. So it'd be the water truck and the new high-definition video display board for a total of $243,950.68.
okay.
Mr. Chair, I move the commission approve the request for reimbursement for Plain Ridge Racecourse Capital Improvement Trust, the two projects totaling $243,950.68.
Second.
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks. We are now to the Ombudsman's Ziemba. We're about 20 minutes behind, but we definitely want to go ahead, I think, with the Plain Ridge report, and then we'll see where we are after that and have a conversation. So let's do item 6A.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. So today I have several items up for consideration. Up first, we have the quarterly report for Plain Ridge Park for the second quarter of this year, ending June 30th. Joining us today as part of the Plain Ridge team are Lance George, General Manager, Reuben Warren, CFO, Michelle Collins, VP of Marketing, Mike Mueller, VP of Operations, and Lisa McKenney, Compliance Manager. And I will turn it over to Reuben.
I will take this. Good morning, Chairman Crosby and Commissioners.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'd like to go over some brief information before turning it over to Ruben and Michelle for their updates. In Q1, we saw the impact of New England weather, and it was reflected in our January and our February numbers. However, we did make a very strong comeback in our Q2 numbers. Our net gaming revenue came in at $46.2 million, which is a growth of $3.4 million over Q2 of last year. In addition, we also saw a growth of $4.2 million as compared to the Q1 time period, and Ruben will go into some of these details during his update. This was a very good quarter for our property. When you look at our win per unit metric, it still remains very impressive. In Q1 of last year, or Q2 of last year, we were at 344 win per unit. Q2 of this year, we have upped it to 375 win per unit. And we're off to an encouraging start in Q3, and that causes us continued optimism in the future. Now, I do want to take a moment to speak about our workforce. As you can see, we have 482 employees. That is up 8 from the 474 that we reported in Q1. Our full-time staffing remains at approximately 500 employees. Our full-time to part-time ratio is staying flat to the numbers we reported in Q1 at roughly 66% full-time and 34% part-time. Okay. Diversity continues to exceed our goals as we remain flat in Q1 at 22%, and our goal is only 10%. When we look at our veterans employment, still at 3%, flat over Q1.
What was the goal?
3.
Three.
Yes. Our Massachusetts residents have increased slightly to 69% of our workforce, and that's up from 68% in Q1. Our local community employment, which is defined as Plainville, Rentham, Foxborough, Mansfield, Attleboro, and North Attleboro, is at 35%. And finally, our male-to-female ratio currently in Q2 is at 53% male and 47% female, which is a slight change from the 51% male and 49% female that we reported in Q1.
I had a question about these numbers. First of all, certainly the numbers are strong, and that's nice to see. But I did talk to Director Griffin about possibly breaking down the numbers, seeing at what level your diversity and your women, where they are in the organization, because I really think those are important numbers as well.
Yeah, we have that
So
available.
that'd be terrific if we could see those numbers as well.
So you're looking for it based on supervisors?
So what Lance is asking for is clarity on what you're looking for. Are you looking for supervisory to,
The breakdown of your organizational chart and where, yes, where the diversity, where the women, where, just where those folks fall within the company hierarchy would be important to see.
we can provide that.
Thank you.
Is there also, are you still experienced or any hiring challenges in certain positions or certain skills, or also seeing turnover and at a little more rapid rate in maybe some of the other jobs?
Good.
So security is an issue for us. The turnover rate has slowed tremendously, so we're figuring out where to advertise to get those jobs from. And so on the lower end of the spectrum of the jobs, the entry-level jobs, we will continue to see the turnover rate, but it's improved. All right, on to the next slide. Our qualified spend per, total spend for Plain Ridge for the second quarter came in at just under 1.6 million. 79% or 1.2 million stayed within the state of Massachusetts. 2017, we're averaging right around 77% of our spend staying in the state. Last year in 2016, the percentage was at 72.4%, so right under 5% higher in 2017. Our local spend, these are our host community, Plainville, and our surrounding communities. We spent right under $90,000 in the second quarter. Plainville continues to be the number one spend at 38%, or right at $34,000. Mansfield stays in the number two position, right under $30,000 for the quarter.
Do you know what, is the Mansfield contract some particular contract, or is it just a bunch of little things?
A bunch of small items for these areas. Our diversity spend, our overall goal, we are meeting that number, and we have consistently done that. The women-owned business enterprise, we've consistently exceeded that goal. The minority-owned, we are struggling in that category. We're at 3%. And our veteran-owned, we lost one vendor in the last quarter, but we're still maintaining that 3%. I'll explain a few things that we're doing on the next slide to try to mitigate some of those losses. So our total overall diverse spend was at $329,000 for the second quarter. We've been averaging about $350,000. We have 5 expos and conventions that we are attending here in this month and next month with all 3 categories, our veterans, our women, and our minority-owned. And the goal, of course, is to allow those guys to understand that we are open for business. We're looking for vendors and partnerships in those 3 specific areas. So the goal, again, is to get out and to introduce ourselves. We do have it on our website, on the state's website, and some other websites. We are part of all chambers, but we believe just getting out in the community, which is the next step, will help us to strengthen those areas that we're falling deficient. Mike alluded to, our business. We're happy to be where we are. Our second quarter was the second strongest since opening the property. Of course, opening that third quarter of 2015 was the strongest. But we brought in $42.6 million in net slot revenues for that quarter. We also contributed $20.9 million in total taxes, $17 million to the state, $3.8 million to the racing fund. And again, I think we're happy to be in this position. Things are trending well. We still have a little work to do, but we're moving in the right direction. The next slide, lottery. great partnership with the lottery. Those numbers continue to impress as well. We produced, or the lottery produced $800,000 for the second quarter. That's 11% higher than the prior year and a little over 12% better than the first quarter of this year.
Is that because of bulk sales, basically? Is it some kind of bulk deals that you do, or is that just individuals buying tickets?
Individuals
Really?
buying lottery tickets.
So you said because you had more people at your casino, you think that
As
helped
we
the
go-
lottery as well?
Yes, as we go, they will go.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
And also working with those guys, I think we have those lottery terminals positioned in the right areas. We are both comfortable with where they are, and we want to continue the great relationship with those guys, so they're happy. We're as well.
Just one
Yes.
point here. It's a data point that has kind of gotten lost in the shuffle, but it's a really amazing number.
Yeah.
Plain Ridge Park Casino accounts for about 7.5% to 8% of the total annual state contribution to local aid to cities and towns. We give about $1 billion a year to cities and towns, and you're doing around 7.5% of that, which is an astonishing number.
Yeah.
And people were worried that the casinos would detract from local aid because it would take away from the lottery,
Right.
which is the primary source of local aid. But in fact, so far, the experience has been an extraordinary add-on.
It's been a positive relationship. Again, I think the surrounding lottery vendors are seeing a pickup as well. So we feel that it's a great partnership. We're not hurting that industry or any around the casino that we feel or have heard. And we are happy with our position.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ruben, can I just go back to the quarter, which which results now retrospectively are really impressive. Would you say, in terms of operations, you figure the market a little bit better, or would you also say that clearly weather, as you started, played a big role in this quarter over quarter or year over year? And can you speak to that?
Yes. I think it's a combination. Again, first quarter, weather hindered the operation. But I do believe that both the property, we figured out how to work with our surrounding communities. We're still figuring that out, looking for partnerships in the community. And so I think it's a combination of us figuring it out. Weather's been great.
Yep.
And so we just look forward to continuing our relationships with local vendors, with lottery, with our surrounding communities.
Thank you.
On to where am I at? I apologize. On to compliance and regulations. We have about 220,000 people that come through our properties on a monthly basis. And so with these numbers, we checked right under 25,000 people through our security checkpoints. We prevented 500 of those individuals which fall into a few categories from entering the property. Minors, which are made up of people 18 years and younger. 33 of those individuals. Underage, which is 18 and under 21 years of age. There's 100 of those individuals. And then expired, no ID, and people that we just can't identify. We've prohibited 368 of those individuals from coming into the property. There were 2 fake IDs, and we had 3 incidences where underage individuals were on our gaming floor. Neither of those individuals consumed alcohol or games. We quickly identified who they were and removed them from the gaming area.
The 25,000 that you, where you check IDs, that's a visual test, basically, right? Your security people just say, if it looks like me, I don't get ID'd, but if it looks younger, you might get ID'd.
If you're at a certain age, we will identify you and ask for ID.
Right.
Run you through the check to make sure your ID is valid, make sure you're of the right age.
Right.
So those are people that we actually stop. We look at the identification, and we either let them onto the floor, or we tell them they need to.
There was a huge drop in the number of checks. The April, May was about 8,500, June was only 7,500.
Mhm.
Why was that?
That I wouldn't, so I did some percentages of the checks, and you're right, we averaged about 275 people a day, skewing higher on the weekends, of course. I would not be able to tell you right now why, but I would say this, we didn't allow any underage on the floor.
Yeah.
I still think we did a diligent job of
Well, in
making
fact, you
sure-
stopped quite a few more.
Yeah.
You know, as a
That's right.
percentage, you got 190 as opposed to 150, 60
Of the checks that we
of the checks that you
identified.
did, yeah.
Yes.
It's just such a big drop. It looks like more than just an everyday run-of-the-mill drop. It's kind of an odd.
I can tell you that the processes don't change for us.
Yeah.
We identify who looks underage, any individual that looks underage. We also make sure that the staff inside of the casino, us walking around, also will make sure that if we see someone that should not be there, we're doing our jobs to alert security to check those individuals. So the processes have not changed. The numbers are a little lower, but we still are comfortable that no one entered the floor that should not have entered.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
Those numbers
I'm
are
a-
good.
Yes,
Strong numbers.
thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to talk about community and marketing.
One before, I think.
Yes.
We continue to support local communities with heavy focus on the surrounding communities for charitable contributions. There are 11 different organizations that we contributed to in Q2. It was about $88,000 in donations, some of which was cash, and then also we utilize our existing relationships with Fenway and the Red Sox so that we can use those items for silent auctions or auction items for some of the smaller charity organizations. A few highlights there is the Friends of Attleboro Animal Shelter. We did a giveaway on National Pet Day, and we had about 400 guests come in with supplies for pets, and they received a $10 free slot play bonus. We're doing the same thing this past month for backpacks for back to school. So again, we see about 400 people that come in and donate. So it's a nice initiative and easy to do for us. We continue to have relationships with the area surrounding community, but also at the larger locations. Xfinity Center, as I mentioned earlier, Red Sox, Fenway. We partnered with them again for the Fenway Concert Series. Rentham Village Premium Outlets, we sponsor a valet program that they have, and we'll continue that through the holiday season this year as well. It allows us to reach people we maybe wouldn't necessarily reach. The shoppers that are coming only an exit away, we can leave a call to action in their car. They put a bottle of water that is Plainridge Park, and then it invites them with a coupon to the casino. So again, it's a way for us to utilize our resources with other local vendors and get more business. We had some other initiatives in Q2 that we haven't done in the past. One, we had the opening day of racing, and this is the largest. We had 125 races this year, which is a record for us. It's the highest that we've ever had.
Racing days.
Racing days, yes, live racing days. We also hosted an event for the Kentucky Derby, Preakness, in Belmont. We saw a 17% increase in handle on Kentucky Derby, 31% increase in handle for the Preakness, and a 11% for the Belmont. So we continue to see growth in our racing. New entertainment. So one of the things we talked about in the last quarter review was doing more in the loft area, the upstairs of the racing area. So it's our banquet space that allows us to seat about 350 people. So we've started to do different entertainment offerings, including acoustic shows, comedy shows. So in Q2, we had Lenny Clark, Lauren Rainbow, who is a medium, and then we partnered with Murphy's Boxing, and we held our first ever live boxing event at the first floor of the racing building. So it was quite exciting. We sold out. It was 550 people that came, and a demographic that typically we wouldn't necessarily get into the building. So,
Excuse me, Michelle,
Yeah.
have we followed up on the conversations, Ed, so how the regulation of boxing and MMA interfaces with our regulation is something we had never really anticipated until you guys started having boxing matches. So there's been a follow-up with Borstels. You said yes, there has? Yeah, yeah. Okay, great.
as we continue to do our larger promotions, such as car giveaways, we also partner with local dealerships. So we did a Corvette giveaway for our anniversary where we work with Imperial in Mendon. They'll have their car on display at our property, so it allows them to do advertising as well as get excitement on property when customers see the vehicles in the driveway. Home makeover with the Home Depot in Mansfield. So again, it just allows us to promote local businesses, but also give us the opportunity to give our guests different items, not the same thing all the time. We had our 2-year anniversary, and we did a coaster giveaway that anyone who came to visit the casino received one. And we did our Massachusetts slot tournament. So this was one winner that received a big Massachusetts slot tournament belt, and Lenny Clark hosted this event. Highlights from this quarter include the Spirit of Massachusetts. This had national coverage, and we saw a 3 times increase in our handle on that day. The purse was $250,000 for that event. We also continued with our initiative for more entertainment offerings in the loft. Those included a pay-per-view viewing event for the Mayweather and McGregor fight, where we sold out and we saw sales of 750 tickets for this event. In addition to that, we had a Verve Pipe acoustic show, and we have 2 Boston Guys comedy that is going to be coming here at the end of September. We did the back-to-school drive that I spoke to earlier. Responsible Gaming Education Week, where we had a theme of empowered play. So we did different initiatives with the GameSense folks, and each day there was an event on property where we promoted responsible gambling, educating customers on what to look for and how we can help them and what resources are available to them.
And you brought Superwoman in.
Yes, that's Lisa McKenney, our compliance officer. And then, again, we have the Audi car giveaway and Choose Your Ride, where we are partnering with Imperial from Mendon.
Great.
Can I clarify one point?
Sure.
June, the numbers, not sure why I didn't bring this up, but seasonality, kids getting out of school, families going on vacations, our numbers were a little lower. That's the reason for the drop in the number of checks in the month of June. Just want to clarify it.
Oh, interesting. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
I had a quick visit down to Plain Ridge on Friday, and as I was leaving, I got in the elevator with this older gentleman and asked him how his day went. He said, not so good. I said, why do you keep coming back to this property? He goes, I bring my wife. And I said, do you like the property? He goes, yeah, we're from Cumberland, Rhode Island, and we like the non-smoking at the facility.
Interesting.
Very nice.
Great.
Anecdotal, but it was
Good.
good acknowledgement of what we've done.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Bring those dollars back from Rhode Island. We like that.
Absolutely. We do too.
Yeah.
All of these promotions look terrific. I hear them advertise every single Red Sox game. They advertise for your casinos.
Anything else from you folks?
I think we're good. Any questions? Thank you.
Great.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, it's 12:15. I think there is nothing here that is particularly urgent. We don't have guests for any of these, right, particularly? We could just stop now and have a lunch break, or we could go through some more. I'm sort of inclined we might as well stop now as any other time, as long as. 30 minutes? Yeah. Does that make sense all right with you, John?
Sure.
Okay, so why don't we take
For 30 minutes.
we'll take a 30, we'll come back at 1:45 and reconvene public meeting 224.
Sound good.
Convening public meeting 224. about 1:15 on September 24th. And we're back to Ombudsman Ziemba.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next up is a request for reappointment of several members of the local community mitigation advisory committees and subcommittees under the Gaming Policy Advisory Committee. As for the LCMAC reappointments, I've included the biographies of these appointees that were provided to you last year. They haven't been updated since last year, but they remain in your packet. We are recommending the following reappointments for the Region B LCMAC. Mr. Rick Sullivan for the Region B representative of a regional economic development organization. Ellen Potashnik for one of the 2 human service provider appointees. And Kate Kane for the Chamber of Commerce representative from Region B. Although Kate has indicated that she will not continue for the whole year, she has agreed to stay on for a meeting or 2 while we work on her replacement. For the Region A LCMAC, we are recommending Colin Kelly as the Chamber of Commerce representative. We're very pleased that these very qualified individuals helped us over the past year and have agreed to continue to help us. As with last year, we will state that these appointments are at the pleasure of the Commission. In addition to these appointments, last year the Commission chose Commissioner Lloyd McDonald as the Commission representative before the Subcommittee on Community Mitigation, Commissioner Cameron as the Commission representative on the Subcommittee on Public Safety, and both of those commissioners were elected as chairs. Congratulations to those commissioners. And Mark Vanderlinden as the Commission representative before the Subcommittee on Addiction Services. So I request reappointment of those members.
Okay. Do we need, is this a vote?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Is there discussion about any of these folks or issues? Just out of curiosity, has the Addiction Services Subcommittee started?
No, we have not met yet.
Because we don't have a quorum still?
We're almost there.
Do you know whether there was any follow-up with the woman from Mount Auburn? The governor's office?
I'd have to ask Mark about that.
But, okay.
Yeah.
All right, do I have a motion?
Yeah, I'd be happy to move. Do we have to mention them in the motion, each one of them, or are they anywhere here?
Just as noted in the memo.
As
Yeah,
noted?
just as noted in the memo,
Okay.
will be fine.
All right. Well, I'll move that the commission reappoint to the regional and diverse several subcommittees here of community mitigation as articulated in the packet to their current positions.
Second? Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
Thank you. Next on the agenda are the 2018 Mitigation Fund Application Guidelines. Chairman and Commissioners, earlier this year, we announced Community Mitigation Fund awards pursuant to the Commission's 2017 Community Mitigation Fund Guidelines. The item before you today is the beginning of the process for approving the guidelines for the 2018 Community Mitigation Fund Program. By statute, applications by communities and other governmental entities are due to the Commission no later than February 1st of each year. In order to give communities time to put together their applications, we plan to issue the final guidelines for the 2018 program no later than the beginning of December. That would give applicants approximately 2 months to put together applications after the final guidelines have been issued. Applicants can also use the period between now and the issuance of the guidelines to determine what applications they may file. It's possible that we may not need to make dramatic changes to the guidelines. The largest change to our guidelines may be warranted when our Category 1 facilities are operational and potentially causing operational impacts. We're a little under 1 year from the projected opening date for MGM Springfield and a little over a year and a half from the projected opening date for the Wynn Boston Harbor facility. The schedule for the potential tribal facility remains unclear at this point, as you know. In order to solicit input and advice on these guidelines in advance of the issuance, we're reconvening meetings of the LCMAC committees and plan to convene meetings of the Subcommittee on Community Mitigation under the Gaming Policy Advisory Committee. These committees include appointees of a host and surrounding communities, regional planning agencies, the Massachusetts Municipal Association, the Department of Revenue, Division of Local Services, and others who will be able to provide very valuable advice. We're planning to have 3 meetings each of the Eastern Mass LCMAC, the Western Mass LCMAC, and 3 meetings of the subcommittee prior to the issuance of our guidelines. In order to make these meetings as useful as possible, we recommend that we develop a list of items that these committees could discuss. In your packets, we've included a list of questions from last year and the results. Additionally, there are questions that the commission and staff have had about the Community Mitigation Fund over the past year. It's very likely that participants at these meetings will have their own items for discussion. My goal for today is to understand if there are additional questions that the commission would like to explore as we develop the guidelines, or if the commission would like to delete or change any question on the list. We anticipate coming before the commission at least twice more on the guidelines by the beginning of December, once to report back on the input we've received and to get approval of a working draft of the guidelines, and once to finalize such guidelines. We've included a draft schedule for the review of the guidelines for 2018. So today, it's designed to just get consensus on a list of questions, which, as noted, will likely grow and change as these local discussions continue. We don't anticipate trying to answer any of these questions today. With that, I welcome any questions you may have about any particular item, or any comment you may have further discussing any of these particular items. And if commissioners come up with questions after today, we can certainly bring those to the attention of all of those committees that I mentioned.
Discussion?
I was not in all of the prior meetings of these committees. I was only in a couple, and there was robust discussion and feedback. But I'm wondering whether we could incorporate, if we haven't already, some kind of feedback from the evolution of the guidelines. Now that we have a couple of years under our belt, and the grants that have been awarded, and what those committees might have to say about maybe what the intention was and what we saw, and whether we can now need to think about questions that we're not thinking about currently. Or, maybe as part of that discussion, we start to rethink one aspect or several of the guidelines. But I think this sort of look-back mechanism may be an important one from my perspective to try to incorporate. There's not a specific question that I can think of. It's simply what we've done. Has it come to the expectations of the committee, or did we put together a guideline that in the past that was too broad or too narrow, and it was not well received? Do we need to rethink the planning grants, for example? I don't know.
Right.
We are in a different stage. There's still a lot of planning that needs to be done, but sort of major, big picture questions, if you will, would be one thing to consider.
I think what you say it makes a lot of sense. What we've been doing after conversations with you in the past, we've been pulling together more enhanced narratives about the status of each one of the grants that we've awarded to date. As you know, with these grants, they do take some time to get up and running. But what we've included in our contracts, and recently, in anticipation of this fall, we've put together those narratives that we can forward to the commission about the status of all our existing grants. And what the procedure is under the statute, actually, under the Subcommittee on Community Mitigation, they're in charge with doing an annual review of our past grants. And so what we are we're assembling, putting together reports based on our awards to date, our expected awards to date, and the status of each one of these projects. We'll be forwarding all these to that subcommittee for a review this fall, and that's part of their mission. And then what we're supposed to do by statute is then take back any recommendations that they have to the commission. So that's baked into the process, and we're in the process of doing that.
Just a comment, as always, thoughtful process. I thought the questions were really on point as to issues that have arisen already.
Right.
So now it's time to kind of answer some of those questions that have, maybe communities have asked, or we just
Right.
hadn't anticipated. So, again, very thoughtful and comprehensive as always.
Thank you.
So I guess you're not really looking for us to discuss these at this point, but just remind me, what was the logic and what was the thought process behind having only, excuse me, municipalities apply?
No, all governmentals can apply for the mitigation fund, either a municipality on behalf of the municipality or a governmental entity on behalf of a regional impact. That's under the statute.
So it says in the last two cycles, entities within communities have applied
Oh, that section.
rather than the community itself. Because the statute says that it has to be a government entity to
Well, so
apply?
the statute says that if there's an impact in one community, it should be the community that applies, and that if there's an impact in more than one community, a governmental entity can apply on behalf of those communities or those.
So a private entity, a nonprofit, for example, under the statute can't apply on its own?
That's correct.
Oh, okay.
Only governmental entities
Okay.
can apply. But if there's a regional impact, for
Yeah.
example, a sheriff's office
Yeah, right.
can apply on behalf of a big region. A community can apply on behalf of nonprofits
Right.
within its borders. for
Which has
impacts.
happened, right.
But then we get into some of the issues of whether or not that is a private benefit under the Constitution.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of different things we have to take a look at in that
Right.
regard.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Anybody else want to contribute? All right. I think we're ready to move on.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioners, my final item is a request by the City of Medford to utilize $5,400 out of its recently approved $60,000 Community Mitigation Fund grant to help Medford conduct an engineering study for a new multi-use path known as the South Medford Connector. With the Commission's approval, Medford would utilize the Mystic River Watershed Association to develop the bid specifications for the consultant to provide advice and assistance in the management of the consultant's contract. Medford is not looking for an increase to this grant and will continue to provide in-kind services relative to the study. We find this request reasonable and ask for the Commission's approval.
Discussion? Do we have a motion?
I'll make the motion that I move that we approve the request of the City of Medford to utilize $5,400 of its $60,000 mitigation award for purposes of retaining the Mystic River Watershed Association to develop bid specifications in connection with that grant.
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
That concludes my report.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Mary.
Next up is item 7, General Counsel Blue and others.
Did you?
Yep.
Yep.
So first, under item 7 today, you have the first draft of what we refer to as the hearing process regs. These are our regulations that govern hearings before both the commission and the hearing officer. And we've had regs for a while on that topic. What we've done in this revision is a couple of things. We've created it, made it very clear that what the commission hears in the first instance as a body versus what the hearing officer hears in the first instance. These are all adjudicatory type proceedings, so we've gone through the statute and divided those into groups that make it easier for people to read and understand. Some of the other things that we've done is we've tried to apply some of the things we've learned as we've gone through the hearing process in terms of what works and what doesn't. So, for example, we've deleted a requirement that people provide briefs to the hearing officer. A lot of our folks are pro se. It doesn't mean they can't, but we didn't make it a mandatory requirement. We've made some changes in how quickly we can schedule hearings because we're trying to make the process quicker and simpler for those folks. So it really is more of a reorganization and a learnings that we're trying to apply. And so what we'd like the commission to do is to take a look at it. We've had a lot of internal discussions with legal and the executive director and the IEB. We will, at this point, send this draft out to our hearing officer to look at, to get input from him, as well as some of our licensees. It's obviously on our website, so we can take comments. But we'd just like to let you have a first look at it. We know it's a little dense and it's very legal. And then we would welcome your input on it before we take it through the process.
Thoughts, comments?
So this is the formal or informal process? Did I miss? Just informal process?
It's really informally informal. We're not actually even on the informal part. This is, the first time. We will start to get some informal comments, but we'll also think about who else might want to see it and comment on it too.
Well, I think that this is an admirable first step in. I think that this is an admirable first step in achieving the objective that General Counsel Blue has just stated of, in a comprehensive way, basically learning from the past several years to revise the regulations in a way that are internally consistent and also provide for a efficient hearing process and allocation of responsibilities between the commission and the other participants.
Anything else?
Yeah, no, I would agree, and also just commend the legal and IEB racing to know where we started 5 years ago with our racing hearings, and to see where we are now in a hearing process is many, many light years forward, and it really is, as an agency, I think we are very professional, and particularly on the racing side, we've really come such a long way, and it's really, it's commendable, the work that's been done by everyone with regard to hearings. So I just want to thank you, and this looks like just as you explained it, which is just clarifying some of the issues that may not have been clear before.
And once we complete this process, we will bring back to you regulations where we have to make technical changes to move language. Currently, there are some regulations where there is hearing language in there. We've moved it out of there and into here. Once we finish this, we'll come back with the technical corrections that we'll need to make, but we wanted to focus on this in the beginning.
The other access of sort of making hearings fair that we're obviously thinking about is when our facilities open up, maybe trying to do the hearings in a locale that is more accessible to people. I think coming in from Springfield for some people might be a burden. So we'll see about how we schedule, where they are, but access is obviously something we want to be fair about also.
Okay. Next one?
Okay. Item 7B is a memo in the packet regarding the Commission's authority to assess fines. This is basically a memo. It doesn't require any action on the part of the Commission. It's just a statutory analysis of how the Commission would assess fines for things like breaches of conditions of licensure and other matters, so that we kind of have an understanding of the process. And what you will see is if you read the statute and go through the sections, the IEB is the sort of the place of first instance in terms of reviewing whether there is a breach of a license condition or there is some kind of breach of a regulation or the statute. They can conduct an investigation. They come with either a fine, recommendation for a fine, or they assess a fine, or a recommendation to the Commission if it revolves around revoking or terminating a license. The Commission is the review body for this, so ultimately you would decide whether the revocation is correct, or you would be the appeal body if it was a fine. There are other regulations already in place that give the IEB the right to enter into settlement agreements before, if they issue a fine and they want to settle with the particular entity involved, they already have that authority and they do exercise that. But this really just puts it in perspective for us and for the people who come before us, what the process could look like. And it's just a way to describe it so that we have something in case we need it to use.
And any kind of action can be initiated, of course, by the commission, but can it also be initiated by the IEB? Is this?
Yes,
does it
or
even matter?
the IEB, a staff person who
Okay.
sees a problem and wants to have it looked at, the executive
Executive.
director. You know, obviously, if it was a staff person, we'd go through the executive director and have that
Right.
conversation. But yes, the idea is that there is an investigation initiated. It is done in a thoughtful, in-depth kind of way, and that there is a fair and consistent recommendation that comes out of it or an action that comes out of it.
Right. Sounds good.
We've talked about this, I think, in the past. Director Wells might want to be a part of this, but it seems that the statute's pretty clear that there is the authority in the IEB on its own to be the determinant initially about fines, at least under some circumstances. So that seems pretty clear. But it seems to me like we ought to have some, and we've had a little, but I want to see where everybody is thinking about this. We ought to have some kind of conversation about, sort of generally speaking, what's our philosophy with respect to fines, both when, how much, just and I know I think IEB is kind of wrestling with this on your own, trying to figure out, use other jurisdictions and so forth to try to get some models, but I think we, the commission, ought to be involved in a conversation about what is the kind of basic practical construct that we're thinking about here. Are we going to be heavy finers or light finers? Are we going to give people first and second chances and then there's a third strike? Some kind of a context that not only gives some guidance to the IEB, but also that gives us an opportunity to just sort of think these issues through rather than just kind of piecemeal some new things happens, IEB has to figure out with no context at all. Well, should we give them a pass this first time, or do we find them X or Y or whatever? So what are you all thinking and doing with respect to setting that? And please feel free to come up, you guys, if you want.
I know at some point in the past, we started this conversation in front of the commission. I would defer to the IEB on what they think about this. I think that probably you don't want to have a philosophy maybe that's very set in stone. And some of what you're describing would also happen organically as things came to you. If it was an appeal
Right.
to you about something, some of that would happen organically, but.
Which has happened like in the racing side, when we've done precisely what I'm talking about. We had no context, zero. Issues came before us, and we just dealt them on a one-off basis, and that has begun to set standards for us. Now we're learning from our own experience, which is fine. That's part of the process. That makes perfectly good sense. But something as big and as comprehensive as this, particularly where we haven't really gotten into the serious operations and the table games where the violations are more likely, seems to me there ought to be some other context as well.
Well, one thing the commission should.
Your mic on.
It's on.
Yeah, should recall that by statute, the commission is generally required to give a notice of some kind of violation before they even have the ability to fine. So that discussion of, do we give them a chance first, or we just go ahead and fine them? By statute, the presumption is you give them a chance first, there's some kind of a notice of an issue before you fine. So we follow that protocol. The other thing, which Attorney Lilios could comment a little bit more on, is we do also have a settlement process. So there's an engagement with the licensee, if there is a fine, to get some kind of feedback and some kind of negotiation there on what's reasonable. So that process is in place, and so far that's been working very well. So I don't know if you have any further comments on that.
Essentially, what Karen referred to as the settlement process is the ability to reach an agreed-upon amount in a fine. So the licensee would essentially agree that a fine is warranted, would have an opportunity to present
any mitigating information or information that our investigation might not have fully uncovered or understood, so that we can get a full view of the facts and then come to, an amount. So already there's an agreement that a fine is appropriate, and then come to an agreement about the amount of the fine. And certainly, we hear from the licensee about that, as well as, we're keeping documents about fines in other jurisdictions as well.
And of course, if there is no agreement, then they would come to the commission and present that all those facts and circumstances.
Exactly.
Your recommendation, your discussions or whatever.
Exactly.
I would rather leave the process sort of open, rather sort of in place the way it is, without necessarily trying to discuss specific thresholds, for example. I know it's at the beginning, just like it was in racing, it's a little disorienting as to what is going to be a framework or a fair approach. But because some of these things are hugely fact-specific, it occurs to me that we need to let a general process like this, which I think is very fair and much of it embedded in statute, work itself through, and we'll just have to see how it goes. And of course, by virtue of doing this, repeatedly or a number of times, we begin to establish precedent and guidelines, rather than trying to do it a priori.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also, we all have the ability to ask questions. I think I've been involved in racing and IEB. When I learn about an issue, okay, what's your process? Lots of time and effort and understanding and warnings have gone out first. We just had a significant suspension the last racing day out at Suffolk, and that was one of the first things I wanted to learn about, was how did the judges come to that significant penalty for this person? And it was very thoughtful process. Other jurisdictions, multiple penalties in the past for similar issues, and I just came away impressed with the process that they went through with our accredited judges, and of course there's an appeal process there as well. But I know we've had the one issue with IEB, and I know how thoughtful that process was,
mean,
and how much time
The one
and
fine,
effort.
the fine that was
Yes,
imposed.
so I know I have to me, it's not, we'll just see how it goes, because I feel like I understand what they're doing and have a real comfort level with the process in which they then come to a decision. So that's helpful to me personally.
Let me also say something I've mentioned to you in the past, and I think it's important, it's worthy of note. When we started with our first appeals in racing, I remember that by the time we were getting them, the issue had taken place so long ago that it was in some cases moot, because the racing season had ended, and it was a little bit perfunctory in some ways at some points, not entirely. But we've worked very hard, the staff has, to really try to shorten that process. It's not very easy, because people have to be duly notified and given the ability to respond and sometimes consult with others, or et cetera, or write a brief and things like that. But as we have incorporated all those lessons, I think to the extent that we can continue to work on understanding and making this process not a barrier, but an enabler of a fair outcome, I think that's important.
There's mention of that in this
Absolutely.
in this document about, we just shortened, the General Counsel Blue, you mentioned it when we talked, we just shortened the amount of time, correct? So
Yeah,
that's,
we did. We had a prior regulation that said we couldn't schedule a hearing any earlier than 30 days. We've removed that. There's a lot of things we can do outside of regs, too. Some of what we've learned is that many times the reason the process takes so long is because some people prefer it takes a long time. They find it to be an advantage. We also find that, the continuances that are being asked for are not continuances on our side. And that's part of dealing with a lot of people who come unrepresented by council. Most of what we see on the individual side, they're not represented by council. So we're looking at ways outside of the regulations to do that, maybe scheduling a one day each month, and this is when the hearings are held, and, you're scheduled on a day. If you don't come, you know when you're gonna come the next month, and, maybe at some point saying, hey, it's now or never, right? So some of those things we're going to work on, and they don't all have to be in regs, but we feel like we understand much better now what causes the delays, and we can address them.
I had a question, Karen. I think it's picking up on something I thought I heard you say in terms of negotiating with respect to a violation and trying to come to some agreement on what the cost of that penalty might be. Did I hear you correctly?
So on the fine.
On the fine?
Yes.
Okay. And just for me, for context, is it, what do you, to the track record that we have, and it's still probably pretty limited,
Yep.
what do you, kind of what's your philosophy of, the cost of that fine? How are you approaching it?
Well, I think, one thing I learned from Assistant Director Band is that you have to look at this as a business model as well. So you've got, say you have an entity in Casino X. If they have some kind of violation and they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing, but it makes them money, if you fine them a fraction of the amount of money that they're going to get because they're committing the violation, well, why would they stop committing the violation? If you fine them $1,000, but they make $500,000 every time they do it, they're never going to do it. So there's sort of an analysis, like a business analysis too, about how much does this matter and what's going to be enough of incentive to deter the behavior or the decision, that kind of decision-making going forward. So much of this is contextual. Some of these things may not be necessarily intentional. There may be a lack of training or some kind of bad judgment on someone's part at the casino. That's a little different than a business decision. We're going to go ahead and do this. So there's so many factors that play into this, and I think it's that gathering of information. What is it? What drove this? What's the history behind this infraction? Has it been done before? How many times have we warned them not to do it? What are the other notices? What were the other contexts when the infraction occurred? And look at that in context. But then the fine amount, we not only look at sort of that business model and how is this going to have a deterrent impact, but also what do other jurisdictions do and sort of what makes sense in the context of how serious the violation is compared to other things.
I remember, and to all of that, I would only add that there's repercussions beyond our own operations here. I remember our own suitability hearings where we were reviewing the history of our the then applicants. The big numbers stand out, and people go and what were the facts and circumstances around it.
Right.
My recollection is that when there was a systemic problem rather than a one-off, even after the warning,
Right.
Those elicit a higher amount because there's a
Right.
implicit larger problem with the organization.
Right.
And that's again something that we'll continue to look at, and our process embeds for all of that.
Right. And I try to listen in the commission meetings as well as to what the commission seems to care about. So, for example, when we were doing the suitability hearings, I remember the original ones for the slot part, there was a great deal of interest and a lot of questions the commission asked about minors on the floor. And I gleaned from that this commission was concerned about that. So that sort of sticks in my mind. So I try to sort of get a sense from the conversations the commission's having, what are the bigger ticket items that this particular commission is concerned about.
Anything else?
Good approach.
Yeah, I'd make an observation to the chair's, question as to whether it would be, in our interest to try to articulate some specifics with regard to the enforcement power. I would be cautious at this stage about being overly particular in that way because, at least as it relates to the casino operations, is that we'd be we'd be operating on a blank state, at least from our personal experience. And we might have ourselves kind of painted into a corner and be hamstrung, in fact, when the real-world environment of the operations of the casinos are different from what we were thinking from this point in time that they might be. That said, I do think that that there could be something to be gained by articulating at this juncture an enforcement policy or statement of objectives, something that would be an analogous exercise of a policy statement to our core values statement and our mission statement. And I seem to recall earlier today we were having a discussion on a policy, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember what the policy was, but that I do think that the general public, not to mention the licensees, would be interested in and assured by some concrete statement of principles to establish a framework, a policy framework for the exercise of the enforcement power.
I like that idea.
I can see something like, we will have prompt and efficient and fair but I'd be interested to see.
I think you want more than that.
Yeah, but exactly what? I mean, I like the idea. I'm not quite sure how to make it operational. It'd be interesting to see if there are such things. Are there sort of statements of principles for enforcement agencies, other than the broadest, fairness and equity type thing?
And there's in the statute, it talks about, requiring a rigorous regulatory scheme,
Right.
so it's not an unreasonable regulatory scheme, but it's
Right.
not, we don't want middle of the road, we don't want the bare minimum. They want, the legislature says, we want a rigorous regulatory scheme. So, I'm mindful of that, but it's somewhat general, as you
Right.
point out.
And in our mission statement, we make we point out the juxtaposition between the need for appropriate regulation on the one hand and the burden of regulation on the other, and set that out as a standard to be attentive to. Do you know of anything, Commissioner? Can you think of any agency that would have some such similar kinds of statement of principles?
I can't cite one, but I'm sure it's there.
Yeah,
I could.
Let us take a shot at looking
Yeah.
at regulatory agencies. I think, like the Commissioner, I'm aware of some law enforcement, prosecutorial agencies that might set out broad guidelines, but let us look at some regulatory agencies with such philosophies as deterrence, punishment, and those such, and just see if there are, statements of broad theory that,
Progressive
we
discipline.
value, whatever the philosophies are for regulatory agencies, and we can't come back and give you some models on those.
Yeah, I think the point is we want to get the message out to the general public that we fully intend to enforce strictly our regulatory agenda. And even if it's generally stated, I think that helps, rather than just to refer people to the detailed regulations that are difficult to distill larger policy objectives from.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a worthwhile effort. I mean, whether we come up with something or not, I don't know, but let's take a look and see if we can come up with something. Anything else on this one?
Can I volunteer to work with the executive director and
Great.
whomever and the IEB on that?
That's even better. I didn't even have to ask for volunteers. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Well, I like strict, but I also like fair, and I know
Oh.
we talked a lot about that, progressive, a lot of those principles we abide by already, but it's good to outline them.
All right, we are on item C.
So under item 7C, we have all of the interested staff folks here that can answer any questions you have about these regulations. Just to sort of set the table on these 4 regulations, this is the final draft in the amended small business impact statement. Every one of these regulations has been through the hearing process. We have received comments. We've incorporated those comments where appropriate. And with your vote today, we would move them through to final promulgation. So I have prepared for each of you a draft resolution for each set of regulations if you choose to move them forward. But we have everyone here available to answer any questions on any one of the 4 regulations in this section.
Well, the chair just whispered in my ear that I could take it just as he had to take a small break. Is there any discussion on the first item? Do we want to hear from our staff on any one of these, one at a time?
Are we on surveillance regulation? Is that the first one?
Yeah, it's not clear. Is that what we're doing? It wasn't clear which is which here.
Well, so this is 7C 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have amendments to
And that's a
205
reference to
CMR
the agenda.
141, which you have had in front of you before, and we've had hearings, and it is updates to our surveillance regulations. And then we have updates to the wide area progressive regulations, 205 CMR 14302. A lot of those, I believe, Mr. Band and Mr. Stembeck would tell you are based on changes to the GLI standards, and so we wanted to incorporate them.
Yeah, I think a very quick synopsis of each one would be helpful before we vote.
Okay.
Sure, just starting with 141,
Mhm.
Commissioners. This was before you before. Most of these changes were suggested by Mr. Band to my right to put us into.
Justin, put on your microphone. Thank you.
Most of the changes to 141 were suggested by Mr. Band to put us in line with best practices in the casino industry. This was out for public comment. There was a public hearing. We received comments from our licensees, some questions, some comments. Mr. Band and I reviewed those. We felt comfortable leaving the text as is. We think that any of the issues raised by licensees can be worked out through conversations with the licensees while maintaining the original language of the proposed changes for 141.
So for 141, we only received one comment from MGM, and you feel, as you said, that the way it's written, leaving as
There were
is?
also comments from PPC, Commissioner.
Oh, from PPC,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
There were a number of comments from PPC. MGM had only the one comment.
Okay. So in the case of both MGM and PPC, the edits that they offer or the comments that they've offered, it's only comments. We feel that they're already addressed the way the regulation.
I think so, or just a conversation would clarify any questions that they would have.
Okay.
So have there been revisions after having received the comments?
No, Mr. Bann and I discussed the comments in detail, and we felt that our language is commensurate with the best practices. We didn't feel any need to change the changes we'd already made. We think that the comments that were raised by the licensees as far as if there had to be a clarification or they had some other small question, we could address that best via direct conversation and while maintaining our language. We think our language is clear and our language is in line with what is appropriate at this time.
So these have already been through the hearing and are before us for final promulgation?
That's correct.
All 4 of these.
Yes, I think we should take them one at a time.
Yeah.
because
Individually.
I agree.
I did want to visit one of the comments.
Yeah.
This was helpful.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So-
Do you want to start with?
Yep. So, Mr. Chair, I move that the commission approve the amended small business impact statement and the final version of 205 CMR 141 as included in the packet, and authorize the staff to take all steps necessary to file the regulation with the Secretary of the Commonwealth and complete the regulatory promulgation process.
Second.
Se-
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
Great.
Just moving on to Section 143, Commissioners, this was with respect to wide area progressive slots. This was also previously before you. It has been out for a public hearing and it received some comments, some questions. after those comments, we did incorporate a few changes, which are in the packet version in the green text. One, they're fairly self-explanatory. The one I would draw your attention to, which without a copy of the GLI standards may not be self-evident, is the very last change in subsection J on the last page of 143. This was due to a typo with respect to the original version. It didn't include the full phrase of what we were seeking to strike and replace in the GLI version, which we're adopting, the full intent of which speaks to the extremely unlikely situation when there would be a simultaneous jackpot in two separate areas on a progressive slot machine, a wide area progressive slot machine. And by this change to the GLI text, what we would have become this new standard would be that if there were simultaneous jackpots that could not be determined in any other way, as far as if one occurred faster or slower, if you went out to the umpteenth decimal point and there was no way to determine who won the jackpot first, in that situation, that this change regulation would make it so that the jackpot was paid out to both players in the full amount, if there was no other way to determine who won first, which through my conversations with Mr. Baroga, seems like an extremely unlikely event. However, it is a practice adopted in at least one other jurisdiction. So that, I wanted to just highlight that because that wasn't clear. I also wanted to make that clear to the licensees and allow them additional time if they wanted to comment on that, because I don't think that was clear from the original package that went out. So I would propose holding out 143 for an additional amount of time to elicit additional comments, because I want to make sure that point is clear.
Let me understand. So it is possible to determine by the time who might have come in first, right?
Right.
In that instance, a second before, the first one gets the jackpot. The second one gets nothing.
The second one would get the advertised value of the reset. So,
Okay. Yes.
yeah.
Whatever transpired, yes. Thank you for that. But in the unlikely scenario that there's no way to determine because the time was so close, they would both get the full value of the jackpot?
That's right. That's what we're suggesting the regulation would be changed to be. The GOI standard, just so you understand what we're basing off of, the GOI doesn't specify, that leaves it to the individual jurisdiction. So what subsection J of our proposed regulation would do would be to change that language to make it clear that in the event that there was no other way to determine who won the jackpot first, both players would be entitled to the full jackpot.
But if I won it at the same time as someone else, doesn't that mean that we both won and should split it?
So within the display of the game, if it was determined that both players won simultaneously, the display or the advertisement of the progressive would display the total amount. So as the value is displayed to the player and that combination is won, they're the rightful owner of that total award.
But what's the logic of not just declaring a tie and splitting the amount equally between the two players who tied?
Well, I think if you think of it like a contract between the slot machine player and the slot machine operator, they're entering the contract by paying for a chance to spin the reels with a chance to win the advertised jackpot, not half the advertised jackpot, the advertised jackpot. And so in the extremely unlikely event, I just want to underline this because I talked to Mr. Baroga about this. He's never heard of this ever happening. And given the technology involved, it's even more highly unlikely because you can go out fractions of a second, essentially, to figure out who won first.
Right.
But in the extremely unlikely event that this were to take place, both players, since they had entered the same contract with the assumption that they were paying for an opportunity to win that jackpot, if it happened at the exact same time, they could be entitled to the full value of the jackpot, not half the jackpot.
I got you.
But when I purchase a lottery ticket, and I understand it's a different kind of game, and someone else has the same numbers.
But I think in that situation, consumer protection, you know that up front. That's clearly demonstrated, whether on the back of the ticket or in the lottery rules, that, there's a drawing, and if there are a number of winners, they will be split.
Don't you know up front as well in the jackpot, in the
If they
white
I think
progressive?
if they advertise it that way, I assume you could do a consumer protection like that. I also assume, they don't get down to nuances, because this is such a potential of a rare occurrence. They think, okay, the disclaimer we'd have to put on is, we're at the risk assessment. What's the risk assessment? You're going to have two ties, when you can go to the machines and say, okay, you won a hundredth of a second before the next person.
Right, and we've looked, we haven't been able to find any evidence this has ever occurred. If this is just, we'd rather have a rule in place than not have a rule in place.
Fair enough. So you mentioned there's one other jurisdiction who does this. Does that mean that everyone else is either silent or split it?
I think most jurisdictions are silent on that.
Yeah, it was, New Mexico actually has a similar requirement where simultaneous jackpots are paid in full. And I'd have to research the other few, but this isn't outside of the norm. This is what is practiced in other jurisdictions today.
To have both winners, theoretically, to have both winners get the full amount.
Correct, and within the help pages of every game that is certified by GLI or BMM, it is clearly displayed your symbol amount equates to that total progressive. So if it was to display, or if the manufacturer were to split up that jackpot, it would inherently state it within the game before it reaches the floor.
So, just because I'd like to understand all these things, what happens in the display when somebody wins it a second or a few seconds,
So
before I win it? Do I
So-
get the display reset in enough time, the reset that you were talking about?
So there's some latency within a few seconds of a jackpot winning and all the associated machines being updated. But
It would show up on the system, though, maybe not in the reels itself,
Yes.
but in the system, it would say this hit and this reset. It might not happen visually automatically, but
In that scenario, then the principle of you have to pay what you display is not going to operate, right? You have to go back to the system to say, okay, even though it actually looked like you had won it, it turns out that somebody won it a few seconds before you did. He just hadn't, gone back to display, correct?
correct.
So we're willing to, for technical purposes, to live with the notion that in some instances, the display is not going to be exactly
Yeah.
what.
But you do have a method to see who won it first
There's a
with
method.
with that. Just mechanically, that
And
just
the
can't
oth-
happen that fast.
It's only when you don't that you have to.
Right, yes,
Okay.
Isn't that very unlikely as well?
extremely.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
You never say never, though. That's,
I understand. But we have a way of determining the photo finish, right?
yes, yes.
Right, and because of the fact that this language wasn't entirely clear in the first go-round, we wanted to put this out again and let our licensees offer their comment, because obviously it's a point of discussion amongst the five of you as well. We expect we'll have a different type of comment, likely from our licensees, and then we can resolve it at that time. So we hold out this piece and not vote on this piece at this point.
Okay, so we're going to postpone this for.
So, yeah, I would suggest that we not vote on this at this point. We can bring it back to the next meeting and see if we have some comments and go from there.
Okay. Next up.
No, there's two more, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
different
Is this the
statute.
continuing
We're
duty?
Different stuff, okay.
We're changing
We're
T.
going to 205, 115, I believe. Yeah.
So this is the continuing duty?
Yes, that's correct. Yep, the continuing duty.
Which one?
So Commissioners,
205,
on this
115.
continuing duty reg, the MGM had submitted some comments the other day, and then we met with some representatives from MGM yesterday. The comments they submitted in writing regarding the SEC filings, I think that issue's kind of a moot point at this point, because, we indicated there's nothing in the reg to say what writings would or would not suffice for submission. So I'm comfortable with any kind of writing that would identify the infraction or any other issue to me. So I had indicated the only issue there was you can't bury the lead. You can't give me a 500-page document and not tell me that the little piece of information is buried somewhere in there. A phone call saying, look at page 17, and there's the information, that's fine. So I think that issue is resolved. The one request they did have was that there be some kind of I don't know, outlet or escape clause in the timing. The 10 days, I think, would be the expectation, but their ask was that in some circumstances, if they got approval from the executive director, could they adjust that 10-day period? I think that would be on a case-by-case basis and somewhat limited, but I did not have an objection to some kind of option down the road if they had some other kind of system for notifying us and that satisfied the requirements. If there's a request for more than 10 days in certain circumstances, then they can make that case. That shouldn't be a problem.
Where is that 10-day?
That's right in the continuing duty. So it says the gaming licensee and each qualifier shall have a continuing duty to notify and update the IEB in writing within 10 days of the occurrence or where applicable, gaining knowledge of the following. So that's
Sorry, I was-
right under 4 in the red on the first page of 115. So this is, I mean, I would describe this as sort of, these are the big ticket items, the kinds of things the commission really wants, and the IEB want to know right away. We don't want to find out 3 months later about some big infraction or an investigation or something like that. That's something we should know right away. And the detail in the reg is sort of giving them some notice of the kind of things we need to know right away.
But the feedback is that in order to put it together, it could take longer than 10 days, as long as they alert you that they're working on it within the 10 days, it would be sufficient? Is that?
Well, I mean, Seth Stratton is here. If you, he's right behind me. So if you want to come up and mention that.
I mean, I think, Commissioner, we start with the fundamental premise, no surprise.
Yeah,
Right?
no,
So
no.
if you need time, that's okay, but there's also a way to inform us so that we're not surprised.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think from MGM's perspective, the conversation, very productive conversation we've had with staff is that we're a large company with a lot of properties, and some of the broader categories in particular, I think we were really focused on subcategory E. We collect all of this information, but with multiple properties throughout the company, a 10-day notice period may be, we certainly, the big ticket items we of course raised, but we have some standard reporting that we could share if we had more flexibility around timing, and if staff thought that that was sufficient, at least flexibility and the right to be able to accept our regular reports that have all this information could be beneficial, and if staff felt that it's not timely enough or wasn't comprehensive enough, then they could, change the requirement, but we thought that flexibility within the regulation to allow for that would make some sense and allow us to continue to collaborate on what's important.
But Karen, you feel that the way it's written, there's enough flexibility afforded?
Well, I think Mr. Grossman has some suggested language. Oh, pardon me. I think Mr. Grossman has some suggested language which gives just that hint of flexibility in the one-off circumstance.
Can I,
Does that mean
before
we have
you,
to promulgate it?
No.
No, this is certainly in line with the proposal. It just adds a little more clarification, so I don't think it requires further hearing or anything like that.
but when I read E, wouldn't it be the case that you know about some complaint, but it just might take you a little longer, and you could notify IEB, look, there's something happened at this property, it may take a little longer to get the paperwork. Is that what we're talking about here?
I think it's a combination of both, Commissioner. We will, some of the, what I'd call smaller items that we want to report and that are required by this and that we become aware of anyway, are reported through a compliance process on potentially a less frequent basis internally, and then we would like to report on the same frequency. Of course, if anything that was kind of the no surprises rule, if anything that was significant would be reported more frequently internally, and we would certainly share that. But arguably, some of these categories could cover permitting issues in another property. So the Springfield property, for instance, wouldn't right away become aware of a permitting issue in Detroit or Mississippi. And those issues all bubble up through the internal compliance reporting process. And we have comprehensive reports that have every issue, and we preview that with staff. But that's not a rolling 10-day. It would be administratively pretty burdensome to report each one of those within a 10-day period is the thought.
But
And-
doesn't, I get the notion of the 10, of the burden, but isn't that mitigated with the $50,000 or greater? Because we're talking about, you know, the suspension or the revocation of a license, that's pretty big, and or so on and so forth, the imposition of a fine of $50,000 or greater. So anything below that, you could report in your regular, you know, compliance calendar.
I think, and this is a conversation that we've had, there are potentially items that could, in theory, if imposed, lead to a fine of $50,000 or greater, or could lead to a potential revocation or suspension if eventually substantiated, that would be subject to our normal compliance process and the normal reporting. Again, all of which we'd share, but I think it's what we're struggling with is the 10-day, we certainly agree with the no surprise rule. And we think that there's an interpretation of the regulation that would be pretty broad, the categories of information that we'd have to report, all of which we have, but on some of the less serious items, with the 10-day reporting period becomes burdensome. And all we're looking for is flexibility within the regulation to say, to give you some examples of that and to show you our compliance reporting process as we open up. And if you think, you know what you're reporting to us regularly already gives us exactly what we want, we don't want to have the handcuffs of the regulation to preclude staff from agreeing to that because, for instance, it's on a 30-day basis instead of 10. So, and it very well may be that we end up, you know, staff says that, and the executive director doesn't approve anything less than 10 days, but we, without going through the promulgation process again, if we can give staff comfort that the reporting process we have in place is sufficient, we'd just like that flexibility.
Mr. Grossman, what is the tweak that you're thinking about?
We discussed adding language after the word occurrence here on the, in paragraph 4, it's the second sentence, to say, unless an alternative filing time is authorized by the executive director. So it adds just some discretion into the process, which is all.
Seems totally fine to me.
Totally fine to me. I don't want to discuss too much longer, but I think, Seth, for whatever it's worth, what I hear you saying is that there may be circumstances in which you don't know if you're going to turn out to have a fine of $50,000 or greater, and that until then, we cannot force you to report something in such tight time frame if you reasonably didn't anticipate that to be the case. When it does, then you really have to report it.
I think that's right, and it's also that we have a really comprehensive process with some significant reporting that includes literally everything that probably could possibly satisfy this, and it's on a regular reporting basis and a really well-organized report that we can provide to staff, and we preview that. It's thick, and we just don't want kind of an artificial time frame to preclude us and staff from saying, you know what, this gives us exactly what we want. And so it's both those issues.
Well, sounds to me that, the addition would accomplish that concern.
Sounds fine to me. Anybody
Yeah,
have a problem with it?
The entire staff is comfortable with it.
Yeah, I just, to put the licensees on notice, the expectation is, it's 10 days. We need, if there's a big ticket item, we're going to need to know. If they want to make a case for something else, of course, we'll hear you out, and we'll see if we can be reasonable, if that makes sense. That's all we're saying.
Quick clarification, and it's notification regardless of whether the individual plans on appealing any ruling. I mean, it's,
Right.
okay.
If Elaine gets a call, we need to know ahead of time, that kind of thing,
Well,
you know?
I mean, it's not like baseball. You're
Right.
suspended, but keep playing until your appeals are.
That's racing, we have that issue.
I'm curious, how can we do this without reopening the promulgation process?
Well,
That's a real question. I'm not, I'm unfamiliar with it.
It's a fair question. I think there's no real great jurisprudence, by the way, on the hearing process or whatever. These are things we've pieced together over time in our experience, because as you can imagine, there have not been a lot of appeals up to the higher levels of the court system on these issues. But my take on the law and my experience is that the whole system is premised on notice and the opportunity to comment, and providing the public with fair notice as to what a board or like this is intending to do. So, and there's no description anywhere in the law as to what that means or anything like that. So the understanding is that if someone comments on something as part of that process, that the board or commission may say, oh, that makes sense, let's make that change. And there's no requirement that before you make any change, you have to go back through the whole process. It's understood as part of the whole comment period that there may be some changes in the initial proposal. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Right.
That said, if you're trying to make any huge change or to a different section of the regulations that were put out for public comment, then I've always said you need to go back through the process. But if you're in the same ballpark of what the proposal suggested, then you can make the change. That's the whole point. And I would say this is squarely within the area that
So
we
it's
were
kind of a
talking-
materiality
Yes.
analysis.
More or less.
Let me offer some historical context or track record. In the past, we've made changes like this all the time to our regulations. There was one instance that I remember well in which that your predecessor, Judge McHugh, said we really need to redo this. Those were after a number of iterations to the internal controls regulations, because the way we started, and they were very substantive, and there were a number of revisions that, upon the whatever iteration, we said, they really need to be out again.
Go back out again.
Because they were so lengthy and they were so revised.
Right.
Necessarily, I should add, but, so.
Okay.
All right, so you're suggesting that we go ahead and move on this. It sounds like all parties are satisfied with this proposed tweak. Do I have a motion?
Chairman, if I could, I just wanted to thank staff for, this is a perfect example of working collaboratively where we raised some concerns. Todd and Loretta and Karen pushed back and said, convinced us that some of our concerns were not justified, but worked collaboratively to have the flexibility. And so we very much appreciate the dialogue and think this is a great example of how licensees and staff are working together to improve the regulations, to make them follow the intent, but make them effective and responsive to our business as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I would ask when you make the motion that you add that we're authorized to make the change as discussed by Mr. Grossman.
Okay, then I move that the commission approve the amended small business impact statement and final version of 205 CMR 115.01 as included in the packet and as amended by Mr. Grossman, and authorize the staff to take all steps necessary to file a regulation with the Secretary of the Commonwealth and complete the regulation promulgation process.
Thank you.
Did I hear a second?
Oh, second.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. Thank you.
Missed that part.
So the next category, the next regulation deals with the categories of people who are required to submit to the qualification process in conjunction with gaming vendor applications. And the changes that we made here are to reduce the number of categories of people who are automatically have to participate in the process, while at the same time giving us more discretion, with the idea that we could be more thoughtful on a case-by-case basis, depending on how a particular company works. In particular, we were eager to change the outside director positions, who, for the primary vendors, all outside directors on audit or compliance were automatically required to qualify. We were finding that those positions rotated fairly often. The new process allows us to dig deeper into how that compliance function actually works and capture the people who we expect to be there over the long haul. And similarly, for both the primary and secondary vendors, the previous reg required us to qualify all the sales representatives or individuals who regularly engage in the solicitation of business. That list was growing for each vendor to a very long list. We ended up feeling that we really were not getting anything too substantive out of that. But again, at the same time, this, the suggested changes allow us to do the case-by-case analysis and still designate as a qualifier anybody that we've determined has a substantial or significant role in the applicant's business.
Did we receive, Loretta, any comments on this from the licensees or others?
We didn't receive any formal comments, but as you might suspect, I had some conversations with vendor representatives, and they were very supportive of the changes.
Discussion? I appreciate the steps in what I think is a constructive direction. That's good.
I agree.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do as well.
Do I have a motion?
I move that the commission approve the amended small business impact statement and final version of 205 CMR 134.04 as included in the packet, and authorize the staff to take all steps necessary to file the regulation with the Secretary of the Commonwealth and complete the regulation promulgation process.
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Are we waiting for Alex?
No, we don't need Alex.
Oh, okay.
Item number D is just requesting the commission's approval to send the racing medication regulations to the legislature. As you may remember, once we get through the promulgation process here, and this has gone through hearings, we need to send them to the legislature, and the legislature has 60 days to comment on them. These regulations have had their hearing. We did not receive any formal comments. That's largely to the very good work of Dr. Lightbaum, who's socialized all of these with her racing stakeholders. And so she's had many and broad and deep discussions at the track level about how this will work and what the thinking is behind it. So today, we're just looking for your approval to send it to the legislature. Once we find out if they have any questions or any concerns, we will bring them back to you for final promulgation.
Mr. Chair, I move the commission authorize staff to send 205 CMR 3 and 205 CMR 4 as included in the packet to the legislature as required by Mass General Law, Chapter 128A.
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
The next item is a regulation that is before you for the first time. This deals with an amendment to 138.13, and this has to do with monthly rewards card statements. this is the first time you've seen it. I have it scheduled for a vote today. If you want us to take it through the process, if you don't feel comfortable or ready to do that, we can certainly hold off.
I seem to remember that we saw a version of this for an informal process,
Probably for the informal process,
think
that
you
may
did,
be,
yeah.
yeah, that may be
Um,
true.
because I remember reading this,
Yeah.
so.
The question, we've talked about this, the question in my mind is, how do you, what is the rule of construction that gets you from mailed to the physical address to being able to substitute email? I understand how everybody thinks email is logical and makes sense, but I don't understand exactly how you get to that out of the language in the statute.
The way we get to that is that it's an additional way to do it. So what we're asking is for the individual to they'll still mail it to their physical address if that's what they want. But if they prefer to have it emailed, they have an option to have it emailed. I look at it as we were giving the player an additional option on how to receive their statement. Just like if they could go to a website and look at it and they wanted to do it that way, if that was their preference. I think we're giving the player the preference. I don't know that the legislature really thought about what players might prefer, but by regulation, we're giving them the preference. If they did want it mailed physically, we'd ask our licensees to do that. I suspect now more people would prefer to have it quicker in an easier format.
I agree.
Well, I agree in terms of what makes sense, but I'm just not sure. Are our strict constructionist okay with this too? I mean, is Loretta, for example, okay with this interpretation?
Yeah, I'm not so sure we ran this one by Loretta. I would, in my strict constructionist interpretation, I would go back to the purpose of the regulation, and I would look at the purpose of the regulation.
Of the regulation or the statute?
I'm sorry, of the statute, of the statutory requirement, in which we're using regulations to fulfill. It strikes me that the purpose of the statute, hence regulation, is notice. And I would, and I think this goes back to your sort of thought process and rationale, I would think in 2010 and 11, and I forget whether this was a carryover from the 2010 version into the Expanded Gaming Act. Well, certainly email was prevalent. I think people are still getting a lot of stuff by mail, and I think now 6, 7 years later, and maybe only anecdotal about, my experience, how much junk mail I just throw out, and if I'm thinking about actually giving someone notice, if I tend to pay more attention, this, again, it's anecdotal, to stuff that comes into my personal email address than often I do to things I consider junk mail. So if I'm trying to figure out today in modern digital technology how to give people notice, and again, this is me, I tend to fall on the side of digital notice versus traditional mail notice. So so in the strict constructions, I go back to how do we fulfill the notice requirement? So I think that's my analysis.
Yeah.
Mr. Petrosian, do you think that there's a problem gaming aspect to this? Where
I am not, this would be the rule against hearsay, but I have heard that in fact, the mail component of it might, and I'm not going to say this right, maybe we want to talk to Director Vanderlyn, but there's actually a discouragement in sending these types of things through the mail, potentially because it's slightly less secure than an email personal notification. You check your own email versus, your mail is somewhat open to the public, even members of your own family and stuff like that. So I have heard, and I would not want to, I'd want to check with Director Vanderlyn on this, that actually mail, there may be not the deterrence factor that people would think for problem gaming as much.
I was thinking it just the other way.
I know, and that's why I was actually
You've got a
surprised.
problem gamer, and the spouse sees an
Yeah.
envelope
Yeah.
from from MGM Resorts.
Right, and I thought the same thing too, and again, we should use the rule against hearsay, but I had a conversation with Director Vanderlander in which it seemed that it was sort of the opposite analysis.
Yeah. I'm comfortable with the discussion about purpose. The purpose is to provide notification to the individual, and it's that person who decides to look at it or not.
And
And it's-
one of the components behind this too is, you know, the patron will have the ability to opt in or out of this program initially. And I assume that, you know, they may, the new Category 1 facilities may, you know, go over this with the local patrons when they sign up for the rewards cards, whether they want this or not.
Right.
So,
Yeah, if you knew that you only could get this by mail, you might be more likely to check, sign me up. Opt out.
I just raised it because, you know, I agree basically with the thrust of your bottom line analysis, but I'm mindful that in other contexts, we've had conversations where
Sure.
powerful statements have been made that when the plain language of the statute says one thing, even though it doesn't really make sense, or it's inconsistent with other public policy, or there's confusion elsewhere in the statute, you're bound by that plain language. And where it here says mail to the physical address, you know, so I think we got to remember to be consistent here. You know, however we're going to interpret one section, we got to be able to interpret other sections. But I'm okay with
fair point.
where you're going.
Yeah, fair point.
But this is not up for vote today, right?
It could be.
It could be if you're ready to have us start the promulgation process, which,
Oh, to start the process?
Yes, to
Yes,
start
to
the,
start it,
so this
yes.
now would go
Have a
out for-
hearing and all that.
yeah, goes out for formal
Public
comments,
comment.
it'll have a hearing,
Let's do that.
so,
So there's opportunity for people
Right.
to
Yeah.
comment on all of this.
yep.
Yeah,
I'm comfortable starting the process.
me too. All right, do I have a motion?
So I move that we start the process, the promulgation process for 138-13 complimentary services of items and promotional game credits.
Second?
Second.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. All right, we're getting close. We're down to item 8, I think. There are a couple of items, just quick updates. I think pretty much everybody's knows on this. Subsequent to the commission's vote some number of months ago to see whether we could get the legislature to clarify the issue about gaming service employees, we have gone hell-bent for leather on that point. We've written the legislature 2 or 3 different times with the commission's recommendation. It turns out that a lot of the local community groups whose constituents would be negatively affected if this can't be amended, that is the automatic disqualification of applicants for gaming service employee jobs who have a vast range of CORI issues. They have been very active. There have been a lot of meetings with legislators, with the leadership. All of the leadership continues to say explicitly and publicly, this was not what we intended. We are going to try to fix this. So there is now an amendment circulating that actually Director Bedrosian gave me, because one that I had sent earlier wasn't quite representative of what the commission wanted as a fix. So we corrected that and sent another one, which is now in circulation. And all the words are right, that there's a pretty good chance that it will be attached as a, what's called outside section to the next supplemental budget, which will hopefully be no later than the middle of next month, which would be okay if we can get that. So everybody's trying, MGM is working hard, and we'll see where it goes. And the other one was, the racing, Commissioner Cameron and I talked about this, and I think I'll take the lead on this, although she'll be there just in case. But Catherine, if you and Alex maybe could just put together some starting bullet points. This is about our legislation, right?
That's correct.
And, but don't write up a big memo or anything, but if you could just do some, what you think are sort of the central bullet points that I should speak to, then maybe the four of us can talk briefly and just make sure that I'm teed up properly. Is that next Tuesday?
That's on the 19th at 1. We actually have started putting together, we put together a short letter that we would file in advance of our testimony, and then we can put some bullet points too.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Mr. Chair, we scheduled a meeting on Tuesday morning just to have that final review, so we'll make
You
sure.
have scheduled it?
Yes.
It's already
So we'll-
scheduled?
A review meeting, yes. So we'll
Okay.
make sure you're free to attend that meeting.
Yeah, okay, that's what I was just checking
Just put
right
that
now.
together
Okay.
with Dr. Lightbaum, knowing you'd want
Okay.
more information.
Okay, good. Let me just make sure that that's, so this is Tuesday, the 26th,
The
Tuesday
19th.
The 19th.
Tuesday, the 19th. Okay. Is that the follow-up meeting? It says follow-up meeting, Ed's office?
No, that's the
That's
actual
something else.
testimony.
All right.
That's the actual testimony.
Okay.
It's Tuesday, the
I'll double
19th
check,
at 1.
make sure we get something, okay, good. Anything else? Oh, I was told by the Senate President apropos of the racing legislation, that from his perspective, there will be no more kicking the can down the road. That if we can't get something, there will be a flatlined legislation. Now, whether that materializes or not, I don't know, but that's what he said.
No, the only other thing, Mr. Chairman, is just to give the public notice. I think we are anticipating our next meeting may be in Springfield.
In 2 weeks hence.
Correct.
Yeah, great. With a lot of associated presentations.
It's not a definite yet?
I think it's a definite, but give people notice. I always say anticipate.
Okay.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I just got a couple of quick updates.
Oh, sorry.
Now, Friday, I had the opportunity, as I mentioned before, I visited Plain Ridge with the director of our State Office of Travel and Tourism. Came down on a race day to see the operations of the only operating casino in Massachusetts. Had some good discussion, heard about a lot of the marketing opportunities going on that Plain Ridge is doing to promote the region. Had a very good AOC meeting on Tuesday out in Springfield. Some early signs of a good economy is, some tension over being able to find the diversity in the construction workforce as more projects are going on. Certainly, more projects are taking place in Eastern Mass as well, and that's driving everybody on the AOC between our licensees and the building trades to work a little bit more closely on some collaborative efforts. The other thing I just want to mention, since we began our work, we have all traveled across the Commonwealth and heard from a wide variety of residents on a number of topics. And a lot of these speakers speak very passionately about their thoughts and our ideas on gaming and a whole number of topics. In May, during our trip to Springfield, we had an opportunity to hear from a thoughtful young man who talked passionately about his own struggles and his hope for opportunity for citizens around Western Mass. Mr. Japhet Robles, single dad, very committed to his community. I think you remember. Sadly, Mr. Robles was the victim of a homicide earlier this week. And Jill and I, as I said, we were out for the AOC meeting, and some of the people we came across were just, between stakeholders and elected officials, were just overwhelmed and devastated by his loss. It's a terrible incident, but obviously we know he leaves a family and some children behind. So hopefully we can keep his family and friends in our prayers.
Thank you, Commissioner Stebbins. That reminds you of what's important in the world.
Can I mention just one thing on the racing? You've made this point even publicly before, but to the extent that we can impress upon the legislature that when they passed the Gaming Act, there was a big policy statement relative to helping racing in the Racehorse Development Fund. But there was a lot that wasn't done, that was left to what we now have before them in 128D. And that's really, I think, how we should lead with, impress upon that this has been only an interim basis.
Right.
Some of the tools that we have been hamstrung by the kicking the can down the road that they've
You're
had,
saying
and
that,
that at least Senate President is not interested in doing, which is good news, would be my big point to them.
You're singing our song, for sure. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Second.
Aye.
Aye.